Hey guys, tonight we're talking about a drug that was literally designed to cure a runny nose and ended up fueling genocide. Methamphetamine started as cold medicine in 1893, got upgraded to help asthma patients breathe easier, and within 50 years became the chemical that powered Hitler's invasion of Europe. A Japanese chemist trying to help people stop wheezing accidentally created the molecular equivalent of pouring gasoline directly into your brain's engine, then watching it explode in slow motion over the next decade of someone's life. Dear viewers, our big goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers on this channel, and with your support, we can achieve it. Only on our channel will you find such interesting and unique stories about drugs. Subscribe so you don't miss them. We're sincerely grateful to everyone who helps us achieve this goal. Also, write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious to see people from all over the world brought together by a single story. And now, let's move on to today's story. To understand how meth went from medicine cabinet to Nazi war ration to American street corner, you first need to understand what happened in a Tokyo laboratory in 1893. Nagai Nagayoshi wasn't trying to create a monster. The chemist was isolating compounds from the ephedra plant, which Chinese medicine had used for thousands of years to treat respiratory problems. He extracted a stimulant alkaloid and named it ephedrine. The substance opened airways, helped asthmatics breathe, and gave users a mild energy boost without obvious danger. Pharmaceutical companies loved it. Doctors prescribed it freely. Nobody saw the shadow growing behind this medical breakthrough. 26 years passed. Akira Ogata, another Japanese chemist, decided ephedrine could be improved. In 1919, he synthesized a modified version by reducing ephedrine's molecular structure, essentially stripping away parts that made it gentle and leaving only the aggressive stimulant core. The result was methamphetamine hydrochloride, a crystalline powder that looked innocent as table salt. Ogata published his findings in a chemistry journal. The paper generated minimal interest. The compound sat in academic literature like an unexploded bomb, waiting for someone to recognize its potential. The chemical mechanism is brutally simple. Your brain normally releases dopamine, the neurotransmitter that creates pleasure, motivation, and focus, in controlled amounts when you accomplish something or experience something good. Imagine dopamine as water flowing through a faucet at a steady, manageable rate. Methamphetamine doesn't just open the faucet wider. It rips the entire faucet off the wall, shatters the pipes, and floods your brain with dopamine at levels your nervous system was never designed to handle. The drug forces your neurons to dump their entire dopamine supply, while simultaneously blocking the reuptake mechanism that normally recycles neurotransmitters. This creates a high unlike anything natural rewards can produce. Food, sex, accomplishment. These might release dopamine at levels of 50 to 100 units. Methamphetamine releases 1,250 units or more. Your brain experiences pleasure so intense it essentially burns out the neural pathways designed to create happiness. Everything else in life becomes colorless and pointless compared to that chemical flood. Users describe the first high as the best moment of their lives. They spend years chasing that feeling again, never quite reaching it, destroying themselves in the attempt. The immediate effect seemed miraculous in the 1920s and 1930s. Users felt superhuman energy, intense focus, confidence bordering on invincibility, and zero need for sleep or food. A factory worker could labor for 20 hours straight. A student could study through the night without fatigue. A soldier could march days without rest. The downside remained hidden because most early users took small doses occasionally, not the massive repeated doses that reveal meth's true nature. German pharmaceutical company Temla noticed Ogata's research in the early 1930s. They saw commercial potential in a stimulant stronger than cocaine, cheaper to produce than amphetamine, and completely legal. By 1934, Temler began synthesizing methamphetamine under the brand name Pervitin. They marketed it as a treatment for depression, fatigue, and narcolepsy. German doctors prescribed it enthusiastically. Pharmacies sold it over the counter. Advertisements showed smiling housewives praising Pervitin for helping them keep spotless homes and cheerful attitudes. The drug spread through German society like water soaking into dry ground. Students bought Pervitin to enhance studying. Workers used it to handle double shifts. Housewives took it to manage cooking, cleaning, and childcare without exhaustion. Athletes discovered it improved endurance and reaction time. Nobody called it dangerous because a respected pharmaceutical company produced it under medical supervision. The pills came in neat packages with precise dosing instructions. This created the illusion of safety. Surely something sold in pharmacies couldn't be harmful. By 1938, Pervitin had become one of Germany's most popular drugs, with millions of doses sold monthly. Users noticed they needed slightly higher doses to achieve the same effect. Some experienced irritability when the drug wore off. A few developed insomnia or anxiety. These seemed like minor side effects compared to the productivity boost. German physicians published papers praising Pervitin's therapeutic benefits. Medical journals recommended it for various conditions. The substance had achieved mainstream acceptance just as Nazi Germany prepared for war. Meanwhile, methamphetamine spread through Japan under different brand names. Nippon Pharmaceutical began producing it as Philipon in 1941. Japanese doctors prescribed it freely for depression, low blood pressure, and chronic fatigue. The Japanese military took note. Officers observed that pilots given methamphetamine could fly longer missions with sharper focus. Infantry soldiers marched farther with less complaint. Factory workers in war production facilities increased output dramatically when given regular doses. The chemical's military potential became undeniable. Methamphetamine removed the human limitations that constrained warfare: exhaustion, fear, hunger, sleep. A soldier on meth could function at peak combat effectiveness far longer than any naturally energized human. The drug didn't make soldiers stronger or faster, but it eliminated the psychological and physical barriers that normally force people to stop, rest, and recover. This aligned perfectly with modern warfare's demands for sustained operational tempo. Neither German nor Japanese military leadership understood they were creating armies of addicts. Addiction was poorly understood in the 1930s. Doctors believed stimulant drugs only caused habituation, a psychological desire to continue use, rather than true physical dependence. The medical establishment thought strong-willed individuals could stop using whenever they chose. This catastrophic misunderstanding allowed military planners to distribute methamphetamine widely, without concern for long-term consequences. The Japanese Navy began issuing methamphetamine to submarine crews in 1940. Submarines spent weeks underwater in cramped, stressful conditions where alertness meant survival. Pilots received it before long reconnaissance flights over the Pacific. Kamikaze units, young men ordered to fly planes directly into American ships, were given large doses before their final missions. The drug transformed terrified teenagers into chemically fearless weapons. German military physicians conducted studies on methamphetamine's combat applications in 1939. They gave it to soldiers during training exercises and measured performance improvements. The results exceeded expectations. Soldiers on Pervitin demonstrated enhanced endurance, improved mood, increased confidence, and reduced perception of pain and fatigue. The physicians recommended widespread military distribution. Wehrmacht leadership agreed immediately. By spring 1940, methamphetamine had become standard issue for German forces. Temmler Pharmaceutical Company couldn't produce tablets fast enough to meet military demand. The Wehrmacht ordered 35 million Pervitin tablets between April and July 1940 alone, during the invasions of France, Belgium and the Netherlands. Every German soldier received meth tablets in their field rations alongside chocolate and cigarettes. Officers encouraged use during combat operations and long marches. The world watched Germany's military machine roll across Europe with terrifying speed and precision. Analysts called it Blitzkrieg, lightning war. They attributed German success to superior tactics, better training, and revolutionary combined arms doctrine. All of this was true, but underneath the strategic brilliance ran a chemical foundation that nobody outside Germany's military fully understood. The Wehrmacht wasn't just better trained, it was pharmaceutically enhanced to operate beyond normal human limits. Tank commanders stayed awake for 3 to 4 days during the French campaign, directing operations without break. Infantry units force-marched through the Ardennes forest for 70 hours with minimal rest, arriving at the Meuse River ahead of schedule. Luftwaffe pilots flew multiple sorties daily without showing diminished performance. French and British forces couldn't match the German operational tempo because they were relying on mere human endurance. They were fighting an enemy that had chemically bypassed biological limits. Heinrich Böll, who later became a Nobel Prize-winning author, served as a German soldier during the invasion of Poland and France. His letters home mentioned Pervitin frequently. He asked his family to send more tablets, describing them as essential for surviving combat. Böll wrote about taking the drug before night marches and during prolonged defensive positions. His casual tone revealed how normalized methamphetamine use had become among German troops. Soldiers discussed Pervitin the way modern soldiers might discuss coffee, a routine performance enhancer that everyone used without shame. The German Military Medical Corps documented Pervitin's effects in clinical terms. Reports noted increased aggression, reduced fear response, enhanced physical endurance, and improved morale among troops. Side effects mentioned in medical files included occasional dizziness, sweating, and difficulty sleeping after extended use. These reports consistently concluded the benefits outweighed the drawbacks. No one recorded the long-term consequences because no one had observed long-term consequences yet. Students at German universities consumed Pervitin during exam periods in massive quantities. Professors noticed unusual patterns, students staying awake for days, completing assignments with manic intensity, then crashing into exhaustion. Some universities tried limiting student access to pharmacies, but the drug was too available to control effectively. Young people believed they had discovered the secret to academic success, without recognizing they were damaging their brains with each dose. German housewives discovered Pervitin helped them cope with wartime hardships. With husbands away at war, women managed households, worked factory jobs, and raised children alone. The drug provided energy to handle overwhelming responsibilities. Chocolate manufacturers began producing Pervitin-laced chocolates called Panzerschokolade, literally tank chocolate, marketed to soldiers but consumed widely by civilians. You could get high-eating candy bars. The normalization of methamphetamine in Nazi Germany created a society running on chemical fuel. People didn't recognize addiction developing because everyone around them was using the drug. When you're surrounded by meth users, meth use seems normal. The collective delusion persisted because short-term benefits were obvious, while long-term damage accumulated silently. Users felt energetic, confident and productive for weeks or months before the psychological and physical deterioration became undeniable. Meanwhile, Nazi leadership consumed methamphetamine at the highest levels. Hitler's personal physician, Theodor Morell, injected the Führer with various drug cocktails that included methamphetamine starting in 1942. Morell's records show he administered the drug frequently, sometimes multiple times daily. Hitler became increasingly dependent on these injections, demanding them before important meetings and public appearances. The man directing history's most destructive war was making decisions while under the influence of the same drug being distributed to his soldiers. By 1940, methamphetamine had woven itself into German military and civilian society so thoroughly that removing it would have caused massive disruption. The drug had become infrastructure, an invisible foundation supporting the Nazi war machine. Soldiers, workers, and citizens relied on it to function at the superhuman pace Nazi ideology demanded. The Third Reich literally couldn't operate without chemical enhancement because it had built its systems assuming meth-fueled productivity levels. But the cracks were already forming. Medical officers began noticing patterns among soldiers using Pervitin for extended periods. Some developed severe paranoia, believing their comrades were plotting against them. Others experienced hallucinations during combat, seeing enemies that didn't exist. A few suffered complete psychological breaks, requiring evacuation from the front lines. The Wehrmacht tried suppressing these reports because acknowledging the problem meant confronting the military's dependence on a drug causing psychosis. The monster Nagai Nagayoshi had accidentally created in 1893 was finally revealing its true nature. What looked like a miracle cure for fatigue was actually a chemical time bomb, destroying brains while giving the illusion of enhanced performance. The Japanese chemist had wanted to help asthma patients breathe easier. Instead, his research had helped create armies of addicted soldiers marching toward catastrophe, high on a drug that made them feel invincible, while it slowly burned out their minds. The German military's methamphetamine distribution reached industrial scale by spring 1940. Wehrmacht logistics officers treated Pervitin like ammunition, essential material requiring constant resupply to forward positions. Each soldier received tablets in standardized doses, typically 3 to 4 pills daily during active operations. Quartermasters tracked Pervitin consumption alongside food, fuel, and bullets. The drug had become as fundamental to German military planning as tanks and aircraft. Leonardo Conti, the Reich health leader, raised concerns about widespread military methamphetamine use in late 1939. His medical staff documented cases of soldiers experiencing heart palpitations, severe anxiety, and psychological disturbances after prolonged Pervitin consumption. Conti wrote reports to Wehrmacht Command recommending reduced distribution and stricter controls. Military leadership ignored him completely. The drug worked too well to abandon over concerns about side effects that only affected some users. Commanders focused on combat effectiveness, not long-term health consequences for soldiers they expected to die in battle anyway. The invasion of France showcased methamphetamine's tactical value at unprecedented scale. German forces advanced through the Ardennes in May 1940 with speed that shocked Allied commanders. Panzer divisions covered distances in days that military planners expected to take weeks. Tank crews operated continuously with minimal rest, sustained by Pervitin and coffee. Infantry battalions marched 40 kilometers daily, then fought effectively upon arrival. French forces retreated faster than German troops advanced, creating chaos that prevented organized defensive lines from forming. Rommel's 7th Panzer Division earned the nickname Ghost Division during the French campaign because it moved so fast that even German high command lost track of its location. Rommel himself stayed awake for days at a time, directing operations from the front while consuming Pervitin to maintain focus. His aggressive tactics and relentless pace overwhelmed French defenders who couldn't comprehend how German units appeared where they should have been impossible. The division covered over 350 kilometers in 11 days, a pace sustainable only through chemical enhancement. German military pharmacologists refined Pervitin delivery methods based on combat feedback. They developed higher concentration tablets for extreme situations requiring maximum alertness. Special forces received ampules of liquid methamphetamine for injection, providing faster onset and stronger effect than oral tablets. Luftwaffe pilots got specially formulated versions designed to enhance visual acuity and reaction time without causing tremors that might affect flying precision. The Wehrmacht was essentially customizing methamphetamine products for different military applications like they were engineering weapon systems. By summer 1940, Pervitin production couldn't meet demand despite Temla running factories at maximum capacity. The Wehrmacht contracted with additional pharmaceutical companies to synthesize methamphetamine under license. German chemical industry pivoted towards stimulant production as a military priority. The economic resources devoted to keeping soldiers high rivaled investments in artillery and ammunition. Nazi Germany was spending enormous sums to maintain an army of functional addicts. Civilian methamphetamine consumption surged alongside military use. German workers saw soldiers taking Pervitin and assumed it must be safe if the military approved it. Factory managers encouraged workers to use the drug to increase production quotas. Coal miners took it to work longer shifts in dangerous conditions. Agricultural workers used it during harvest seasons when labour demands peaked. The distinction between military and civilian meth use dissolved as German society embraced chemical enhancement across all sectors. German doctors prescribed Pervitin for increasingly dubious medical reasons as the drug's popularity grew. Patients reporting mild depression received methamphetamine prescriptions. Women seeking weight loss got it as an appetite suppressant. Students struggling academically were given it to improve concentration. The medical profession had abandoned careful evaluation in favour of dispensing a drug that patients demanded because it made them feel invincible. Physicians rationalised this by citing the drug's pharmaceutical pedigree and widespread military use as evidence of safety. The psychological effects of mass methamphetamine consumption began manifesting across German society in subtle ways. Crime rates increased, particularly violent crimes committed impulsively. Domestic disputes escalated to physical violence more frequently. Traffic accidents surged as drivers operated vehicles while experiencing meth-induced overconfidence and impaired judgment. These social problems developed gradually enough that authorities didn't immediately connect them to widespread drug use. People attributed rising violence to war stress rather than recognizing that millions of Germans were high on a powerful stimulant that increased aggression and reduced impulse control. German soldiers on the Eastern Front consumed Pervitin in staggering quantities after the invasion of the Soviet Union began in June 1941. The vast distances, brutal weather, and fierce Soviet resistance created operational conditions where staying awake meant survival. Soldiers took multiple doses daily, sometimes exceeding recommended limits by factors of 3 or 4. Medical officers distributed the drug freely because keeping men combat effective took priority over health concerns. The alternative was watching exhausted soldiers freeze to death or get killed by Soviet counterattacks. Wehrmacht medical records from late 1941 documented disturbing patterns. Soldiers returning from extended combat reported severe depression, inability to sleep even when exhausted, and episodes of paranoid thinking. Some experienced auditory hallucinations, hearing voices or phantom sounds that didn't exist. Others developed violent behavioral changes, attacking fellow soldiers over minor disagreements. The medical corps recognized these as adverse drug reactions, but lacked authority to halt Pervitin distribution without approval from military command. Commanders refused to act because removing methamphetamine would cripple combat effectiveness. Otto Ranke, a military physician and one of Pervitin's strongest advocates, began documenting cases that concerned even him. He observed soldiers who had used methamphetamine continuously for months, showing signs of severe psychological deterioration. These men couldn't think clearly, made irrational decisions under fire, and sometimes suffered complete mental breakdowns requiring evacuation. Ranker recommended limiting Pervitin to short-term use only, suggesting 2 to 3 days maximum before mandatory rest periods. The Wehrmacht implemented half-hearted restrictions that field commanders routinely ignored under combat pressure. German submarine crews represented an extreme case of methamphetamine dependence. U-boats operated underwater for weeks at a time in claustrophobic conditions with constant danger. Crew members took Pervitin to stay alert during extended patrols, where one moment of inattention could sink the entire submarine. By 1942, virtually every German submariner was using methamphetamine regularly. The drug became so associated with U-boat service that sailors called it submariner's medicine. Naval medical officers noticed submariners showed higher rates of psychological problems compared to surface vessel crews, but the nature of submarine warfare left no alternative to chemical enhancement. Hitler's personal methamphetamine use intensified as the war progressed. Theodor Morell's medical records show the Führer received injections containing methamphetamine and other drugs with increasing frequency from 1942 onward. Hitler demanded these injections before important meetings, claiming they helped him think clearly and maintain energy, despite deteriorating health. The injections became so routine that Hitler grew agitated and irritable when Morell wasn't immediately available to administer them. The dictator directing Nazi Germany's military strategy was experiencing textbook addiction symptoms while making decisions affecting millions of lives. Morell's records reveal the cocktails he injected into Hitler contained methamphetamine, mixed with various other substances including testosterone, animal organ extracts, and vitamins. The physician essentially experimented on the Führer, trying different combinations without clear therapeutic rationale. Hitler believed these injections were keeping him healthy and energetic, when in reality they were causing cumulative damage to his cardiovascular and nervous systems. By 1943, Hitler's behavior showed signs of stimulant abuse. Rapid mood swings, paranoid thinking, increasingly erratic decision-making, and physical tremors that Morell attributed to Parkinson's disease, but might have been meth-induced. We hope you've already subscribed to our channel, and if not, please do so right now. Our goal is to reach our first 1,000 subscribers. This is very important to us. Only on our channel will you find such interesting and unique stories about drugs. Subscribe so you don't miss them, and we'll get back to the story. The Wehrmacht's methamphetamine supply chain became a strategic vulnerability as the war turned against Germany. Allied bombing campaigns targeted pharmaceutical factories, including those producing Pervitin. As production declined, the military faced the prospect of millions of addicted soldiers suddenly deprived of the drug they'd come to depend on. Withdrawal symptoms among troops included severe fatigue, depression, and cognitive impairment, exactly the opposite of what combat soldiers needed. The Nazi military machine had engineered its own weakness by building operational doctrine around drug-enhanced performance. German military leadership attempted damage control by issuing new regulations limiting Pervitin distribution in 1942. The order restricted the drug to frontline combat units and emergency situations, theoretically ending routine daily distribution. In practice, enforcement proved impossible. Field commanders who had relied on methamphetamine to maintain combat effectiveness ignored the restrictions. Soldiers who had used Pervitin for months or years experienced withdrawal symptoms and demanded continued access. The drug had embedded itself too deeply in German military culture to remove through administrative decree. Captured German soldiers provided Allied intelligence with information about Pervitin use. Interrogators discovered that Wehrmacht units routinely distributed methamphetamine, and that soldiers considered it essential for combat operations. This intelligence reached Allied medical and military planners, who studied the implications. Some Allied commanders wondered if their own forces should adopt similar chemical enhancement strategies. The idea was seriously debated before being largely rejected based on concerns about addiction and long-term health effects. The Allies chose to fight without pharmaceutical assistance, accepting the tactical disadvantages this created. Nazi propaganda never acknowledged the military's dependence on methamphetamine. Official communications portrayed German soldiers as naturally superior warriors whose victories stemmed from racial and ideological supremacy rather than drug use. The reality was less inspiring. Millions of young men forced into combat and kept functional through chemical coercion. The Third Reich had industrialized drug addiction, turning it into a weapon of war that ultimately destroyed the men it was supposed to enhance. By 1943, the German military's methamphetamine supply had become critically strained. Temmler's production capacity couldn't keep pace with demand, as Allied bombing destroyed facilities and supply lines fractured. The Wehrmacht prioritized Pervitin distribution to elite units and critical combat sectors, abandoning widespread availability. Soldiers who had used methamphetamine for years suddenly faced enforced withdrawal while fighting desperate defensive battles. The psychological and physical consequences were predictable. Combat effectiveness declined precisely when Germany needed it most. German military medical files from 1944 paint a grim picture of an army suffering collective drug withdrawal. Soldiers reported overwhelming fatigue, inability to maintain alertness during combat, severe depression, and loss of motivation. These symptoms appeared across units that had previously demonstrated high combat effectiveness. Medical officers recognized the connection to reduced Pervitin availability, but could do nothing to address it. The drug that had powered Blitzkrieg had become a liability, as Germany lost the capacity to produce it in sufficient quantities. The collapse of Nazi Germany in 1945 left behind millions of addicted soldiers, workers, and civilians. The methamphetamine problem didn't end with military defeat. It simply transformed into a different kind of crisis. German pharmaceutical companies had distributed hundreds of millions of Pervitin tablets during the war years, creating addiction on a scale never before seen in human history. The drug that was supposed to make the Third Reich invincible had instead created a nation of addicts facing the psychological and physical consequences of years of abuse. The German methamphetamine story revealed a fundamental truth about stimulant drugs. Short-term benefits come with long-term costs that eventually exceed any tactical advantages. The Wehrmacht had gambled that the war would end before those costs became unbearable. They lost that gamble catastrophically. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, Japan was conducting its own experiment with mass methamphetamine distribution, one that would create even more devastating social consequences in the war's aftermath. Japan had been manufacturing methamphetamine since the 1920s, but military application accelerated dramatically after 1941. Dainippon Pharmaceutical Company produced the drug under the brand name Philipon, marketing it initially for narcolepsy and depression. The Japanese military noticed the same performance enhancements that had attracted German attention. Soldiers who didn't sleep, didn't complain, and followed orders without hesitation. By 1942, methamphetamine distribution became standard practice across all branches of Japan's armed forces. The Imperial Japanese Navy distributed Philipon to pilots with calculated precision. Fighter pilots received tablets before long-range missions over the Pacific where combat could last hours and exhaustion meant death. Bomber crews took it to stay alert during nighttime raids. Reconnaissance pilots flying solo missions over vast oceanic expanses relied on methamphetamine to maintain focus when no land was visible for hundreds of kilometers in any direction. The drug transformed human limitations into manageable problems solvable through chemistry. Kamikaze units presented a unique pharmaceutical challenge. Young pilots, many still teenagers, were ordered to fly planes loaded with explosives directly into American warships. These weren't combat missions with survival as an objective. They were one-way suicide attacks requiring pilots to override the most fundamental human instinct: self-preservation. Methamphetamine provided a chemical solution to this psychological problem. Large doses administered before takeoff transformed terrified boys into focused weapons who could execute their missions without paralysis from fear. The drug didn't create courage, it simply suppressed the neurological mechanisms that generate terror. Kamikaze pilots high on methamphetamine reported feeling detached from reality, as if they were watching themselves from outside their bodies. This dissociative state proved ideal for suicide missions because pilots could view their impending deaths with pharmaceutical emotional distance. The Japanese military had discovered how to chemically override survival instincts, turning humans into guided missiles through precise drug administration. Japanese submarine crews consumed Philipon in quantities that rivaled German U-boat usage. Submarines operating in the Pacific faced even more extreme conditions than their European counterparts: longer missions, greater distances from support, and American anti-submarine warfare that made every patrol potentially fatal. Crew members took methamphetamine to manage the psychological stress of prolonged underwater operations, where enemy depth charges could crush the hull at any moment. The drug became synonymous with submarine service in the Japanese Navy. Factory workers in Japan's war industries received methamphetamine to increase production output. Munitions plants operated around the clock with shifts of workers taking Philipon to stay productive during 16-hour workdays. Aircraft factories distributed the drug to assembly line workers who needed to maintain precision while exhausted. Shipyard labourers used it to keep pace with demands for new vessels, despite inadequate nutrition and minimal rest. The Japanese war economy ran on methamphetamine almost as much as it ran on steel and oil. The Japanese government encouraged civilian methamphetamine use far more openly than Nazi Germany had. Pharmaceutical companies advertised Philipon in newspapers and magazines as a cure for fatigue, depression, and low productivity. Advertisements showed happy workers and cheerful families, suggesting the drug-enhanced quality of life rather than created addiction. The marketing worked. Civilian consumption skyrocketed throughout the war years as ordinary Japanese people sought chemical assistance coping with wartime hardships. Students preparing for university entrance examinations consumed Philipon in massive quantities. The Japanese education system was brutally competitive, and methamphetamine offered an edge that made sleepless study marathons possible. Parents purchased the drug for their children, viewing it as an investment in academic success rather than recognizing it as dangerous substance abuse. Teachers sometimes recommended it to struggling students. The normalization of methamphetamine in academic settings created a generation of young people who associated the drug with achievement and success. Japanese physicians prescribed methamphetamine for conditions that had nothing to do with its actual pharmacological effects. Patients with mild anxiety received it. People complaining of general malaise got prescriptions. Women seeking energy to manage households while husbands served in the military were given Philipon as if it were vitamins. The medical profession had abandoned diagnostic rigour in favour of prescribing a drug that made patients feel better immediately, regardless of whether it actually treated their underlying conditions. The Japanese military's methamphetamine distribution reached peak levels during the final years of the war as defeats mounted and desperation grew. Soldiers defending Pacific Islands against American invasions took the drug to fight beyond the point where exhaustion would normally force surrender. Officers used it to maintain morale among troops facing certain death. The drug couldn't compensate for American material superiority, but it kept Japanese forces fighting longer than they could have without chemical enhancement. This prolonged resistance cost additional lives on both sides while delaying the inevitable outcome. Japan's defeat in August 1945 created an unprecedented crisis. The military had accumulated enormous stockpiles of methamphetamine for an invasion of the Japanese home islands that never occurred. Warehouses contained millions of doses. Some estimates suggest over 50 million tablets, intended for soldiers defending against American landings. When the war ended, these massive stockpiles suddenly had no military purpose. The occupation authorities failed to secure them promptly, and desperate people looted pharmaceutical warehouses in the chaos following surrender. Military methamphetamine flooded Japan's civilian market within months of the war's end. Former soldiers brought their military-issued supplies home. Pharmaceutical company warehouses were broken into and emptied. The Japanese government, overwhelmed by the challenges of occupation and reconstruction, couldn't effectively control drug distribution. Methamphetamine became widely available through black markets that operated openly in bombed-out cities. A substance that had been military-controlled became accessible to anyone with money or goods to trade. The psychological devastation of defeat made Japanese society particularly vulnerable to methamphetamine's false promise of relief. Millions of people had lost family members, homes and livelihoods. Cities lay in ruins. The economy had collapsed. Trauma and depression affected entire populations. Methamphetamine offered temporary escape from unbearable reality. It made users feel energetic, confident and hopeful when their circumstances were hopeless. The drug spread through defeated Japan like fire through dry grass. Unemployed soldiers represented the highest risk population for methamphetamine addiction. These men had been trained for war, given methamphetamine to enhance combat performance, and then suddenly had no purpose and no legal access to the drug they'd been taking for years. Many turned to black markets to continue use, spending whatever money they had on pharmaceutical-grade meth or crude versions produced in improvised laboratories. Some former soldiers became dealers themselves, using military connections to distribute stockpiled supplies. The warrior class had transformed into a drug trafficking network almost overnight. Japanese organized crime syndicates, the Yakuza, recognized methamphetamine's profit potential faster than anyone. These criminal organizations had survived the war intact and possessed the distribution networks necessary to move drugs efficiently. Yakuza groups seized control of black market meth distribution, establishing territorial monopolies in major cities. They recruited chemists to synthesize new supplies when military stockpiles diminished. Within 2 years of the war's end, organized crime had transformed Japanese methamphetamine from a military logistics problem into a permanent criminal enterprise. The scale of methamphetamine addiction in post-war Japan shocked observers who understood the problem's magnitude. Conservative estimates suggested 500,000 Japanese used the drug regularly by 1948. More realistic assessments put the number above 1 million. Some researchers believe 2 million people, roughly 2% of Japan's entire population, had become addicted. No society in human history had experienced addiction rates approaching these levels. Japan was conducting an unintended experiment in what happens when industrial-scale drug production meets societal collapse. Japanese cities developed visible methamphetamine subcultures that functioned openly, despite being illegal. Certain neighborhoods became known for drug availability, where users gathered in bombed-out buildings or makeshift shelters to use together. These weren't hidden underground scenes. They operated in plain sight because police lacked resources to suppress them. The occupation authorities focused on preventing political unrest and rebuilding basic infrastructure, treating the meth epidemic as a secondary concern that could be addressed later. The medical consequences of mass methamphetamine abuse became impossible to ignore by 1950. Hospitals treated growing numbers of patients experiencing drug-induced psychosis, cardiovascular problems, and severe malnutrition from extended use. Psychiatrists documented cases of stimulant psychosis that persisted for months or years after users stopped taking the drug. Neurologists observed patterns of permanent brain damage in long-term users. The healthcare system couldn't cope with the volume of meth-related medical emergencies while simultaneously dealing with war injuries and disease. Criminal activity surged in correlation with methamphetamine use. Theft, robbery, and violent crime increased dramatically in neighborhoods where meth was widely available. Users desperate for money to buy drugs committed crimes they wouldn't have considered while sober. The drug's effects, paranoia, aggression, impaired judgment, turned otherwise law-abiding people into criminals. Police records from the early 1950s show clear statistical relationships between methamphetamine availability and crime rates in specific districts. Japanese pharmaceutical companies that had produced Philipon during the war faced minimal consequences for their role in creating the addiction crisis. Some attempted to resume legal methamphetamine production under the pretense of medical necessity. Others pivoted to manufacturing legitimate medications while quietly maintaining underground meth synthesis operations. The occupation authorities initially lacked clear policies about what to do with companies that had legally produced drugs that were now causing social catastrophe. This regulatory vacuum allowed pharmaceutical companies to avoid accountability for their contributions to mass addiction. The Japanese government finally recognized the methamphetamine crisis as a national emergency in 1951. Officials realized that ignoring the problem had allowed it to grow beyond containable levels. The Ministry of Health estimated that addiction rates were increasing rather than declining naturally, suggesting the crisis would worsen without intervention. Parliament passed the Stimulant Control Law in 1951, making methamphetamine possession and distribution criminal offences with severe penalties. Enforcement would prove far more difficult than legislation. Police launched aggressive crackdowns on methamphetamine trafficking and use starting in 1952. Officers raided known dealing locations, arrested users in possession of drugs, and pursued Yakuza organizations controlling distribution networks. The initial arrests numbered in the thousands. Prisons overflowed with meth-related offenders. Courts processed drug cases as quickly as possible, while maintaining some minimal standard of due process. The criminal justice system strained under the volume of cases generated by attempting to arrest and prosecute its way out of an addiction epidemic. The crackdown worked, but only through brutal persistence and resources that few governments could sustain. Japan's methamphetamine use declined significantly by 1955, as sustained law enforcement pressure made the drug harder to obtain and more dangerous to use. Treatment programs helped some addicts recover. Social stigma discouraged new users from starting. The combination of enforcement, treatment, and cultural change gradually reduced addiction rates. By 1960, Japan's meth crisis had diminished to manageable levels, though it never entirely disappeared. The cost of this success was measured in destroyed lives and diverted resources. Tens of thousands of people died from overdoses, medical complications, or meth-related violence during the epidemic's peak years. Hundreds of thousands suffered addiction's long-term consequences: brain damage, psychological disorders, and social marginalization. The government spent enormous sums on enforcement and treatment that could have funded reconstruction efforts. Japan had paid a devastating price for its wartime methamphetamine policies. The Japanese meth epidemic demonstrated that mass drug distribution creates problems that outlast the circumstances that caused them. The military had distributed methamphetamine for tactical reasons during wartime, never considering what would happen when the war ended and soldiers brought their addiction home. This pattern would repeat itself in different forms across the Pacific and eventually in the United States, where pharmaceutical companies and military planners made similar miscalculations with similar consequences. American pharmaceutical companies had been synthesizing amphetamines since the 1930s, but methamphetamine production accelerated dramatically after World War II. Smith, Klein and French marketed benzodrine inhalers containing amphetamine for nasal congestion, but users quickly discovered they could break open the inhalers and consume the drug-soaked paper inside for a powerful high. The company responded by developing tablet forms that were easier to prescribe and harder to abuse. This logic was backwards. They made amphetamines more accessible by turning them into pills. Abbott Laboratories introduced disoxin in 1943, marketing pharmaceutical-grade methamphetamine for depression and obesity. The drug was identical to what German soldiers had consumed as Pervitin and Japanese troops had taken as Failopon. American doctors prescribed it freely without understanding they were distributing the same substance that had created addiction epidemics across Germany and Japan. The pharmaceutical companies certainly knew. They had access to post-war reports documenting the disasters in both countries. They sold it anyway. The marketing was brilliantly insidious. Pharmaceutical advertisements in medical journals portrayed disoxin as a modern solution to common problems that plagued American housewives. One advertisement showed a smiling woman in a spotless kitchen, with the captions suggesting methamphetamine could help mothers manage household duties without exhaustion. Another targeted the patient who is overweight and depressed, positioning meth as appropriate treatment for what were often normal responses to difficult circumstances. Doctors trusted these advertisements because they appeared in prestigious medical publications. American physicians prescribed methamphetamine with shocking casualness throughout the 1950s. A woman complaining of fatigue while raising children might leave her doctor's office with a month's supply of pharmaceutical meth. Students struggling with demanding coursework received prescriptions to improve focus. Workers in physically demanding jobs got it to maintain energy. The medical establishment treated methamphetamine like a mild stimulant comparable to coffee, rather than recognizing it as the highly addictive substance that had devastated two major nations. The weight loss angle proved particularly profitable for pharmaceutical companies. Post-war American culture emphasized slim female bodies as ideal, creating enormous demand for appetite suppressants. Methamphetamine worked spectacularly for weight loss. It suppressed appetite completely while increasing energy expenditure. Women who had struggled with diets for years found the pounds melting away effortlessly. They didn't realize they were losing weight because they were high on meth and had stopped eating while their metabolism burned at unsustainable rates. Truck drivers discovered methamphetamine's value for long-haul routes independently of medical prescriptions. Drivers needed to stay awake for extended periods to maximize delivery efficiency and income. Amphetamines and methamphetamine gave them artificial alertness that made 20-hour driving shifts possible. Some drivers obtained prescriptions from sympathetic doctors who understood the economic pressures of the trucking industry. Others bought pills from fellow truckers who had legitimate prescriptions and sold their excess supply. A black market developed within the trucking industry years before meth became associated with street crime. College students embraced amphetamines during the 1950s as study aids, particularly during final examination periods. Campus health clinics prescribed the drugs readily to students who claimed they needed help concentrating. Some universities had so many students using pharmaceutical stimulants that study drugs became normalized aspects of academic culture. Students didn't view this as drug abuse. They saw it as pragmatic use of medical technology to enhance performance in a competitive educational environment. The rationalization was identical to what German students had told themselves 15 years earlier. The entertainment industry ran on pharmaceutical amphetamines throughout the 1950s and 1960s. Hollywood studios had tight production schedules requiring actors and crew to work grueling hours. Studio physicians, known colloquially as script doctors, distributed amphetamines and methamphetamine freely to keep productions on schedule. Major stars received regular prescriptions that sustained them through back-to-back filming commitments. Some developed severe addictions that destroyed their health and careers, but the studio system covered up these problems to protect valuable assets and maintain the illusion of glamorous lifestyles. President John F. Kennedy received regular injections from Dr. Max Jacobson, a New York physician whose patient list included numerous celebrities and politicians. Jacobson's injections contained methamphetamine mixed with various vitamins, steroids, and other substances in combinations he adjusted based on patient requests rather than medical necessity. Kennedy began seeing Jacobson in 1960 during his presidential campaign, using the injections to maintain energy during the exhausting campaign schedule. The practice continued after his election. Kennedy took Jacobson to the Vienna summit in June 1961 for his meeting with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. The president received multiple injections before the crucial negotiations that would shape Cold War dynamics. Kennedy was essentially high on methamphetamine while making decisions that could have led to nuclear war. His staff worried about Jacobson's influence, but couldn't convince the president to stop the injections. Kennedy claimed the treatments made him feel sharper and more energetic, unaware that the drug was impairing his judgment while giving him the illusion of enhanced clarity. The Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961 occurred during the period when Kennedy was receiving regular methamphetamine injections from Jacobson. The disastrous operation resulted from multiple failures of judgment and planning. While methamphetamine wasn't solely responsible for the invasion's failure, the president's reliance on chemical enhancement raises questions about whether his decision-making was compromised. Leaders high on meth experience overconfidence and reduced risk assessment, precisely the cognitive distortions that could lead to catastrophic foreign policy mistakes. American pharmaceutical companies produced staggering quantities of amphetamines and methamphetamine during the 1950s and 1960s. Industry estimates suggested 8 billion amphetamine tablets were manufactured annually by 1960. This represented enough pills to supply every American with approximately 44 doses per year. Not all of these were methamphetamine specifically. The category included related amphetamine compounds, but the scale of legal stimulant production dwarfed any legitimate medical need. Pharmaceutical companies were manufacturing industrial quantities of addictive stimulants and distributing them through medical channels. The Food and Drug Administration demonstrated remarkable passivity about the amphetamine boom. The agency had authority to regulate drug manufacturing and distribution, but largely deferred to pharmaceutical companies' claims about safety and efficacy. FDA officials accepted industry-funded studies showing minimal addiction risk and ignored independent research suggesting otherwise. The regulatory capture was nearly complete. Companies producing billions of stimulant pills annually faced minimal oversight from the agency, supposedly protecting public health. Medical literature from the 1950s contains remarkable examples of doctors dismissing amphetamine addiction concerns. Journal articles claim the drugs were non-habit forming and safe for long-term use. Physicians wrote case studies describing successful treatment of obesity and depression with months or years of continuous amphetamine therapy without acknowledging addiction development. The medical profession had convinced itself that pharmaceutical-grade stimulants were fundamentally different from street drugs, even though the chemistry was identical. Black markets for pharmaceutical amphetamines developed alongside legal prescription channels. Some doctors wrote excessive prescriptions, either through poor judgment or deliberate complicity in diversion schemes. Pharmacists sometimes filled forged prescriptions without adequate verification. Pharmaceutical company employees stole products from factories and warehouses. These diverted pills supplied users who couldn't or wouldn't obtain legitimate prescriptions, but wanted access to pharmaceutical-grade stimulants. The distinction between legal and illegal amphetamine markets blurred significantly. Organized crime recognized pharmaceutical amphetamine's street value earlier than law enforcement did. Criminal organizations established relationships with corrupt physicians who wrote prescriptions for non-existent patients or grossly excessive quantities. The prescriptions were filled at multiple pharmacies to avoid suspicion. Then the pills were sold on the street at significant markup. This model proved extraordinarily profitable because the product was legal pharmaceutical-grade drugs that carried less risk than heroin or cocaine trafficking. Criminals were exploiting the legal system's vulnerabilities to run what were essentially drug-dealing operations with partial legal protection. The military distributed amphetamines to American forces during the Korean War and later Vietnam, continuing the tradition established by German and Japanese forces during World War II. Fighter pilots received amphetamines to maintain alertness during long missions. Special forces used them during extended operations requiring sustained performance without rest. The Pentagon justified this as medical necessity in combat environments, ignoring or dismissing evidence from other countries that military amphetamine distribution created long-term addiction problems among veterans. American sports embraced amphetamines with enthusiasm that rivaled any other sector. Professional baseball players used greenies, slang for amphetamine pills, to enhance performance and maintain energy during the grueling season schedule. Football players took them before games to increase aggression and pain tolerance. The drugs were so common in professional sports that trainers distributed them openly in locker rooms. Athletes believed everyone was using stimulants, creating pressure to take them simply to remain competitive. This was performance enhancement through systematic drug use, normalized within sports culture and ignored by officials who should have prevented it. The medical profession's blindness to amphetamine dangers stemmed partially from the drug's pharmaceutical origins. Doctors trusted medications produced by major pharmaceutical companies and approved by the FDA. The idea that these legitimate medications could be as dangerous as street drugs contradicted their professional training and threatened their authority as medical gatekeepers. Acknowledging that they had been prescribing highly addictive stimulants to millions of patients would require admitting catastrophic failures of judgment and oversight. By the mid-1960s, America had created a pharmaceutical methamphetamine problem that paralleled what Japan had experienced after World War II, except the American version was entirely legal and medically sanctioned. Millions of Americans were taking prescription methamphetamine or related amphetamines regularly. Many were addicted but didn't recognize it because their drugs came from pharmacies with doctor approval. The infrastructure was in place for a massive addiction crisis. It just hadn't become visible yet because the drugs were legal and socially acceptable. The turning point came gradually as evidence of amphetamine dangers became impossible to dismiss. Emergency rooms treated increasing numbers of patients experiencing amphetamine-induced psychosis. Psychiatrists documented severe depression and cognitive impairment in long-term users. Cardiologists observed heart damage in young patients whose only risk factor was chronic stimulant use. Medical journals published studies showing clear addiction patterns among prescription amphetamine users. The pharmaceutical fantasy that these drugs were safe was collapsing under the weight of accumulated evidence. Congress began investigating amphetamine abuse in 1970. hearing testimony about the scale of pharmaceutical production and diversion to black markets. The hearings revealed that drug companies were manufacturing far more amphetamines than legitimate medical use could possibly require. Witnesses testified about doctors who prescribed stimulants indiscriminately and pharmacies that filled obviously fraudulent prescriptions. The investigation exposed how pharmaceutical companies and the medical profession had created a legal drug distribution system that functioned like organized crime with better public relations. The Controlled Substances Act of 1970 placed amphetamines and methamphetamine in Schedule II, recognizing them as highly addictive drugs with limited legitimate medical use. This represented a dramatic shift from the previous regulatory approach that had treated them as safe medications. Pharmaceutical companies fought the restrictions, arguing they would prevent legitimate patients from accessing necessary medications. The companies lost this battle because the evidence of widespread abuse and addiction had become overwhelming. The era of legal mass methamphetamine distribution was ending, but the damage had already been done. Millions of Americans who had taken prescription amphetamines for years suddenly faced restricted access as regulations tightened. Some managed to stop using the drugs despite withdrawal symptoms. Others sought new sources, illegal suppliers who had no quality controls or safety protocols. The tightening of pharmaceutical amphetamine availability didn't eliminate demand. It simply pushed users toward more dangerous alternatives. The stage was set for illegal methamphetamine production to fill the void that pharmaceutical restrictions had created. The pharmaceutical crackdown created a vacuum that motorcycle gangs filled with entrepreneurial efficiency. Outlaw biker clubs, particularly the Hells Angels, Outlaws and Bandidos, had members who understood chemistry well enough to synthesize methamphetamine in crude laboratories. These weren't sophisticated operations. Early biker labs consisted of equipment stolen from high schools or purchased from chemical supply companies, set up in garages, abandoned buildings, or remote properties where explosions wouldn't attract immediate attention. The first outlaw chemists learned methamphetamine synthesis from pharmaceutical literature that was publicly available in university libraries. Academic journals published detailed synthesis routes intended for legitimate researchers, never considering that criminals would use them as instruction manuals. A biker with basic chemistry knowledge could follow these published procedures to produce methamphetamine using legally available precursor chemicals. The scientific community had inadvertently provided criminals with complete recipes for manufacturing the drugs that pharmaceutical companies could no longer legally distribute in unlimited quantities. Ephedrine and pseudoephedrine became the foundation of biker meth production. These chemicals occurred naturally in the ephedra plant and were synthesized commercially for use in asthma medications and decongestants. Anyone could walk into a pharmacy and buy bottles of Sudafed or other cold medications containing pseudoephedrine. Biker chemists extracted the pseudoephedrine from cold pills, then used it as the starting material for methamphetamine synthesis. The process was dangerous and produced toxic waste, but it worked. The Hells Angels established the first organized methamphetamine production and distribution network in California during the late 1960s. The club recognized that controlling meth manufacturing would generate enormous profits, while creating a product they could distribute through networks already used for marijuana and LSD. Senior club members recruited chemists. Some were bikers with college chemistry backgrounds. Others were professionals willing to cook meth for money. These chemists trained others, spreading knowledge of synthesis techniques throughout the outlaw motorcycle world. Biker meth quality varied dramatically from batch to batch. Professional pharmaceutical manufacturing controlled purity, potency, and consistency through rigorous quality assurance. Outlaw labs had no such controls. One batch might be relatively pure methamphetamine. The next could contain toxic byproducts from incomplete reactions or contaminated starting materials. Users had no way to know what they were getting. This unpredictability made biker meth more dangerous than pharmaceutical products had been, but it was available and increasingly affordable as production scaled up. The synthesis process itself posed severe hazards that biker chemists often ignored or didn't understand. Methamphetamine production requires handling extremely flammable solvents, corrosive acids, and reactive chemicals that produce toxic fumes. Lab fires and explosions became regular occurrences as inexperienced cooks made mistakes with lethal consequences. Some died when their labs exploded. Others suffered severe chemical burns or respiratory damage from fume exposure. The survivors became more cautious, developing safety practices through trial and catastrophic error. Law enforcement initially failed to recognize the scope of biker methamphetamine production. Police departments in the 1970s focused primarily on heroin and cocaine, viewing methamphetamine as a minor problem limited to specific subcultures. Investigators didn't realize that motorcycle gangs had industrialized meth production, creating supply chains that could deliver drugs across multiple states. By the time authorities understood the extent of biker involvement, the organizations had become sophisticated criminal enterprises with established territories and distribution networks. The counterculture's appetite for drugs created enormous demand that biker suppliers were happy to fill. Speed, the street name for methamphetamine, became popular in hippie communities alongside marijuana and LSD. Users appreciated the drug's stimulant effects for all-night parties and music festivals. Unlike pharmaceutical meth, biker speed was cheap enough for unemployed young people to afford regularly. The outlaw motorcycle clubs had found a massive market that pharmaceutical restrictions had created but couldn't satisfy legally. Violence accompanied biker methamphetamine trafficking as rival clubs fought for control of lucrative territories. Motorcycle gang wars erupted across California and the Southwest during the 1970s, with meth manufacturing and distribution rights as primary stakes. Clubs used intimidation, assault, and murder to maintain monopolies in their regions. The Hells Angels proved particularly ruthless in eliminating competition, establishing dominance over California meth production that would last decades. This wasn't recreational drug use. It was organized crime operating with military-style territorial control. The Bandidos Motorcycle Club controlled methamphetamine production and distribution across Texas and the Southwest by the mid-1970s. The organization operated multiple labs producing industrial quantities of meth that supplied dealers throughout the region. Bandidos enforced their monopoly through extreme violence, making examples of independent cooks who tried operating in their territory. The club's national structure allowed coordination of manufacturing and distribution across state lines, creating efficiencies that independent criminals couldn't match. They had built a methamphetamine cartel before Mexican drug organizations even recognized the drug's potential. Outlaw chemists continually refined their synthesis methods, improving yields and reducing production costs. Knowledge sharing within motorcycle clubs meant successful techniques spread rapidly through the biker community. Chemists who discovered more efficient reactions or cheaper precursor sources gained status within their clubs. This created perverse incentives for innovation. The most talented criminal chemists earned respect and money by making meth production easier and more profitable. The drug war was inadvertently funding research and development for illegal pharmaceutical manufacturing. Prison sentences for meth manufacturing remained relatively light during the 1970s compared to penalties for heroin or cocaine trafficking. Judges and prosecutors didn't view methamphetamine as seriously as opioids or cocaine, resulting in sentences that were insufficient deterrents for the profits involved. Biker chemists could reasonably calculate that the financial rewards justified the risk of moderate prison time if caught. Some clubs rotated members through cooking duties, accepting that occasional arrests were business costs worth paying. The chemical supply industry inadvertently enabled illegal methamphetamine production by selling precursors and equipment to anyone with cash. companies marketed glassware, heating elements, and chemicals to biker-controlled front businesses without asking questions about intended use. The suppliers either didn't realize they were supporting illegal drug manufacturing or chose to ignore obvious evidence because the sales were profitable. Regulatory oversight of chemical sales was minimal, creating a legal market that served illegal purposes. Biker meth culture developed distinct characteristics that differentiated it from pharmaceutical amphetamine use. Users called the drug crank because bikers supposedly hid methamphetamine in motorcycle crankcase compartments during transport. The term became synonymous with biker-produced meth regardless of how it was actually transported. Crank users were typically working-class people, truckers, construction workers, factory labourers who used meth to work longer hours and maintain energy in physically demanding jobs. This demographic differed significantly from the housewives and students who had used pharmaceutical amphetamines. Injection became the preferred route of administration for many crank users, unlike pharmaceutical meth users who had primarily taken pills orally. Injecting methamphetamine produces more intense effects faster than oral consumption, creating stronger reinforcement that accelerates addiction development. Needle sharing among users spread hepatitis and other blood-borne infections. The combination of impure meth, contaminated injection equipment, and users' poor health practices created a public health disaster that was largely invisible to mainstream society because it affected marginalized populations. The environmental consequences of illegal meth production began emerging in the late 1970s as abandoned lab sites were discovered. Each pound of methamphetamine generated approximately 5 to 6 pounds of toxic waste, containing heavy metals, solvents, and corrosive chemicals. Biker cooks dumped this waste wherever was convenient, in fields, rivers, sewers, or simply abandoned it at lab sites. Properties used for meth production became contaminated with chemicals that soaked into soil and groundwater, creating long-term environmental hazards. Cleanup costs often exceeded property values, leaving taxpayers to pay for remediation. President Nixon launched the War on Drugs in 1971, directing federal resources toward drug enforcement and criminal prosecution. The initiative focused primarily on heroin and cocaine importation, largely ignoring methamphetamine despite growing evidence that biker production was expanding rapidly. Federal agencies lacked expertise in investigating illegal chemical manufacturing operations and underestimated motorcycle gangs' organizational sophistication. The war on drugs missed one of its primary targets because law enforcement was fighting the wrong battles against the wrong enemies. The Drug Enforcement Administration, created in 1973, initially struggled to address methamphetamine production effectively. DEA agents trained to investigate heroin and cocaine trafficking found meth labs completely different from importation-based drug operations. Investigating illegal chemical manufacturing required understanding of chemistry, precursor sourcing, and supply chains that differed fundamentally from interdicting smuggled drugs. The agency needed years to develop expertise specifically targeting methamphetamine production, during which biker labs operated with relative impunity. California emerged as the epicenter of American methamphetamine production by 1980. The state's large motorcycle gang presence, accessible precursor chemicals, and enormous drug market created ideal conditions for meth manufacturing. Labs operated in rural areas of Northern California, in desert regions of the South, and even in suburban neighborhoods where neighbors didn't recognize the signs of chemical production. California was becoming the methamphetamine capital of America, though most residents remained unaware of the scale of production happening in their communities. The Reagan administration escalated the drug war significantly after 1981, increasing funding for enforcement and prosecution while implementing mandatory minimum sentences. Methamphetamine received more attention as evidence accumulated that biker production was supplying millions of users across the country. Federal task forces began targeting motorcycle clubs systematically, using RICO statutes to prosecute entire organizations rather than individual members. The pressure increased significantly on biker meth operations, though the demand for their product remained as strong as ever. Biker motorcycle clubs responded to increased enforcement by compartmentalizing operations, separating manufacturing from distribution to limit individual members' criminal exposure. Cooks operated independently, selling to distributors who might not even be club members. This structure made investigations more difficult because arresting a cook didn't necessarily reveal the distribution network or organizational leadership. The clubs were adapting to law enforcement pressure by becoming more sophisticated criminal organizations with better operational security. The profit margins in methamphetamine trafficking were extraordinary compared to other criminal enterprises. A competent chemist could produce a pound of meth for approximately $500 in precursor chemicals and supplies, then sell it wholesale for $5,000 to $10,000. Distributors could cut and resell that pound for $20,000 or more at street level. No other drug offered comparable returns on investment with such readily available starting materials. Motorcycle clubs were making millions of dollars annually from meth operations, money that funded weapons purchases, legal defense, and organizational expansion. Independent chemists, not affiliated with motorcycle gangs, began producing methamphetamine in the 1980s after learning synthesis techniques from published sources or contacts within biker communities. These independent operations couldn't match biker production scale, but served local markets in areas where motorcycle gang presence was limited. Some independents were remarkably entrepreneurial, developing innovative synthesis routes or precursor sourcing methods that improved on biker techniques. The democratization of meth production knowledge meant that enforcement actions against one organization didn't eliminate the problem because someone else could start cooking with relative ease. The methamphetamine problem had transformed fundamentally from its pharmaceutical origins. What had been a medical disaster caused by overprescription had become a criminal enterprise controlled by violent organizations producing contaminated drugs in illegal laboratories. The transition from legal pharmaceutical production to outlaw manufacturing had made methamphetamine more dangerous, more profitable, and essentially impossible to eliminate through enforcement alone. The monster had escaped the laboratory completely and was reproducing in the wild. Mexican drug trafficking organizations watched American methamphetamine markets throughout the 1980s with calculated interest. The cartels had built billion-dollar empires trafficking cocaine and heroin, but methamphetamine presented unique advantages that traditional drugs couldn't match. Cocaine required coca plants grown in South America. Heroin needed poppy fields in Mexico or Asia. Methamphetamine required only chemicals and knowledge. No crops, no weather dependence, no agricultural vulnerabilities. A chemist with proper equipment could produce meth anywhere. The Guadalajara cartel made the first major move into methamphetamine production in the mid-1980s. Cartel leadership recognized that American biker labs were producing limited quantities with primitive methods while demand was enormous and growing. Industrial-scale production using professional chemists and proper equipment could flood the American market with higher quality product at lower prices than biker crank. The business logic was irresistible. Methamphetamine represented pure profit with fewer logistical complications than cocaine or heroin importation. Mexican cartels possessed advantages that motorcycle gangs couldn't match. They had capital to invest in sophisticated laboratory equipment and large quantities of precursor chemicals. Their organizations included logistics experts who managed international supply chains. Corruption networks within Mexican government and law enforcement provided protection that American biker gangs could never obtain. The cartels could operate industrial facilities producing metric tons of methamphetamine monthly, scales that made biker production look like amateur hobby chemistry. Cartel recruiters sought out chemists with expertise in synthetic organic chemistry, offering salaries that exceeded what legitimate pharmaceutical companies paid. Some recruits were Mexican nationals with advanced degrees who saw opportunities for wealth that normal careers couldn't provide. Others were American chemists seduced by money and adventure, willing to cross ethical and legal boundaries for six-figure incomes. The cartels assembled teams of highly trained professionals who brought industrial pharmaceutical knowledge to illegal drug manufacturing. The first cartel superlabs appeared in rural Mexico during the late 1980s. These weren't crude operations in garages or abandoned buildings. They were purpose-built industrial facilities with proper ventilation, professional glassware, precise temperature controls, and quality assurance protocols. A single superlab could produce more methamphetamine in 1 week than 100 biker labs produced in a year. The scale transformation was comparable to the difference between home cooking and factory food production. Precursor chemical sourcing proved easier for cartels than anyone had anticipated. Pharmaceutical companies in China and India manufactured ephedrine and pseudoephedrine in bulk quantities for legitimate cold medication production worldwide. These companies would sell to anyone with money, asking few questions about intended use. Cartels established import businesses that purchased chemicals legally, creating paper trails suggesting legitimate pharmaceutical manufacturing while actually supplying meth production. Some Chinese companies knowingly sold to drug trafficking organizations because the profits were extraordinary, and Chinese enforcement of international drug precursor agreements was minimal. The cartels developed pseudoephedrine extraction techniques that were far more efficient than biker methods. Instead of buying retail cold medications and extracting pseudoephedrine from pills, cartel chemists purchased pure pharmaceutical-grade precursors by the ton. This eliminated the tedious extraction process entirely, allowing direct conversion of precursors to methamphetamine. Production costs dropped dramatically while purity increased. Cartel meth was superior to biker crank in every measurable way. Stronger, cleaner, more consistent, and cheaper. Crystal methamphetamine, the highly purified form that could be smoked, emerged from cartel labs in the early 1990s. Japanese chemists had developed crystallization techniques decades earlier, but the knowledge had remained relatively obscure. Cartel chemists rediscovered and perfected these methods, producing methamphetamine in large transparent crystals that users called ice or glass. Smoking crystal meth delivered the drug to the brain faster than snorting or swallowing, creating an intense rush that accelerated addiction development. The cartels had engineered a delivery system that made their product more addictive than previous forms. The pharmacology of smoked methamphetamine created addiction with frightening efficiency. When users smoked crystal meth, vaporized drug molecules entered their lungs and passed directly into the bloodstream, reaching the brain within seconds. This rapid delivery produced an immediate, intense high that reinforced use more powerfully than slower administration routes. The faster a drug reaches the brain, the more addictive it becomes. This is fundamental neuropharmacology. The cartels had optimized methamphetamine for maximum addiction potential, whether intentionally or as a byproduct of improving product quality. Distribution networks for cartel methamphetamine utilize the same routes and methods that moved cocaine and heroin into the United States. Smugglers hid meth in vehicle compartments, concealed it in legitimate cargo shipments, and transported it through tunnels under the border. The infrastructure was already in place. Cartels simply added methamphetamine to their product portfolio without requiring significant new investment in trafficking capabilities. This operational efficiency made meth trafficking extremely profitable compared to drugs requiring separate smuggling operations. The Sinaloa cartel emerged as the dominant methamphetamine producer by the mid-1990s, operating multiple superlabs in Mexico's rural regions. The organization's leadership understood that controlling meth production, from synthesis to street distribution, created vertical integration that maximized profits while reducing risk of law enforcement interdiction. Sinaloa labs produced crystal meth of unprecedented purity, 90% or higher compared to the 60% typical of biker crank. This quality difference was immediately apparent to users, who recognized that cartel product was simply superior. Cartel methamphetamine flooded rural American communities first, targeting areas where economic decline had created populations vulnerable to addiction. Small towns in the Midwest and Mountain West that had lost manufacturing jobs or experienced agricultural collapse proved particularly susceptible. These communities lacked the social services infrastructure to address addiction, had inadequate law enforcement resources, and suffered from social isolation that made drug use easier to hide. The cartels identified and exploited America's economic weakness with precision. American motorcycle gangs initially fought to maintain their methamphetamine market dominance against cartel competition. Biker organizations had controlled meth production and distribution for over 2 decades, and they weren't surrendering without conflict. Violent confrontations erupted as biker clubs tried defending territories against cartel-supplied distributors. The bikers lost these battles decisively. They couldn't match cartel resources, violence capacity, or production scale. By 2000, biker methamphetamine production had declined to a fraction of its 1980s peak, overwhelmed by superior cartel operations. The economic impact on biker clubs was devastating. Methamphetamine trafficking had funded their organizations for decades, paying for clubhouses, legal defense, weapons, and member support. Losing meth income forced organizational changes. Some clubs shifted toward other criminal enterprises, while others essentially dissolved as members drifted away when the money disappeared. The cartels had achieved through economic competition what law enforcement had failed to accomplish through decades of prosecution. They had largely eliminated biker methamphetamine production by making it unprofitable. Mexican government corruption facilitated cartel methamphetamine operations at every level. Local police protected lab sites in exchange for bribes. State officials ignored evidence of industrial chemical deliveries to rural areas. Federal authorities selectively enforced drug laws, targeting cartel rivals while allowing favored organizations to operate. Some government officials weren't merely corrupt, they were active partners in trafficking operations, receiving percentages of cartel profits in exchange for providing intelligence about law enforcement activities and ensuring shipments crossed the border unmolested. The profitability of cartel methamphetamine operations exceeded even cocaine trafficking by some measures. A kilogram of cocaine cost cartels approximately $2,000 to purchase from Colombian producers, then sold wholesale in the United States for $15,000 to $25,000. A kilogram of methamphetamine cost approximately $500 to produce in a cartel lab, then sold wholesale for similar prices as cocaine. The profit margins were exponentially higher for meth because cartels controlled production, rather than purchasing from suppliers. This economic reality drove increasing cartel investment in methamphetamine production throughout the 1990s and 2000s. American law enforcement agencies struggled to adapt to the industrialization of methamphetamine production. DEA strategies developed for combating biker labs proved ineffective against cartel superlabs operating in Mexico beyond U.S. jurisdiction. Interdiction efforts at the border captured some shipments, but had negligible impact on overall supply because cartel production capacity far exceeded demand. For every kilogram seized, 10 more crossed the border successfully. The mathematics of enforcement were unwinnable. Cartels could produce meth faster and cheaper than authorities could interdict it. Cartel violence in Mexico escalated dramatically as organizations fought for control of methamphetamine production territories. The Sinaloa cartel battled rivals including the Gulf Cartel, Juarez Cartel, and later the Jalisco New Generation Cartel for dominance over lucrative meth manufacturing regions. These conflicts killed tens of thousands of people in Mexico between 2006 and 2020, transforming parts of the country into war zones. Methamphetamine's profitability made it worth killing for, and cartels had demonstrated willingness to use unlimited violence to protect their interests. The technology and sophistication of cartel superlabs continued advancing throughout the 2000s. Chemists developed new synthesis routes using different precursors when pseudoephedrine became harder to obtain. They engineered processes that reduced toxic waste production, making labs easier to operate covertly. Quality control improved to pharmaceutical standards. Some cartel meth was purer than anything produced legally during the medical era. The cartels were conducting industrial research and development in illegal chemistry, creating innovations that legitimate pharmaceutical companies might have patented if the products weren't destined for drug trafficking. Cartel methamphetamine pricing undercut biker production so severely that street-level costs dropped to historic lows by 2010. A dose of meth that might have cost $50 in the 1990s was available for $5 or less in many markets. This price collapse made the drug accessible to populations who couldn't have afforded it previously, expanding the user base dramatically. Lower prices combined with higher purity created the perfect conditions for an addiction epidemic. Cheap, powerful drugs available in unlimited quantities to anyone who wanted them. The cartels achieved what Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan had attempted. They industrialized methamphetamine production for mass distribution, except their goal was profit rather than military performance. The result was the same: millions of people using a drug that destroyed their brains while generating massive revenue for the organization supplying it. The scale had grown from thousands of Wehrmacht soldiers to millions of American civilians, but the fundamental dynamic remained unchanged. Methamphetamine was being distributed systematically to populations that couldn't resist its addictive properties. American demand for methamphetamine appeared essentially infinite. No matter how much cartels produced, markets absorbed the supply. This endless demand created perverse incentives for cartels to maximize production, leading to construction of even larger superlabs. By 2015, some Mexican facilities could produce multiple tons of methamphetamine weekly, quantities sufficient to supply millions of users indefinitely. The cartels had created pharmaceutical manufacturing operations that rivaled legitimate drug companies in scale and exceeded them in profitability. The transformation from biker labs to cartel superlabs had made methamphetamine cheaper, purer, and more available than ever before in history. The drug that began as Japanese cold medicine, powered Nazi conquest, and fueled biker culture had become an industrial product mass-produced by criminal organizations with resources exceeding small nations. Every attempt to control methamphetamine had failed, and the problem was now worse than it had ever been. The cartels had won the meth war before most Americans realized the war was even happening. Rural America became ground zero for methamphetamine devastation during the 1990s and 2000s, while urban areas focused on crack cocaine. Small towns in Iowa, Missouri, Indiana, Oklahoma, and throughout the Midwest saw meth use explode as manufacturing jobs disappeared and agricultural economics collapsed. These communities had no experience with serious drug problems. Heroin and cocaine were city drugs that rarely penetrated rural areas. Methamphetamine filled the void left by economic desperation, with a substance that was locally produced, relatively cheap, and initially seemed like it helped people work harder and longer. The geographic distribution of meth addiction mapped precisely onto economic decline. Counties with closed factories showed higher addiction rates than economically stable regions. Agricultural areas struggling with falling crop prices and rising input costs experienced worse problems than prosperous farming regions. Unemployment and meth use correlated so strongly that economists could predict addiction rates by looking at job loss data. The cartels and remaining independent cooks weren't randomly targeting communities. They were exploiting economic vulnerability with pharmaceutical precision. Small-scale methamphetamine production spread through rural communities like a virus jumping between hosts. The shake-and-bake method emerged in the early 2000s, allowing cooks to produce small quantities of meth using a 2-litre plastic bottle, cold medication, and readily available chemicals. This technique required no sophisticated glassware or elaborate setups. Someone could cook meth in their car or a motel bathroom using supplies purchased at Walmart and a pharmacy. The democratization of production meant that anyone desperate or entrepreneurial enough could become a manufacturer. The shake-and-bake method was extraordinarily dangerous despite its apparent simplicity. The reaction occurred in a sealed plastic bottle under pressure, creating risk of explosion if the cook didn't release pressure at proper intervals. Users often worked while high on meth themselves, impairing their judgment and coordination. Bottles exploded regularly, covering cooks with flaming chemicals that caused severe burns. Some victims died from their injuries. Others suffered permanent disfigurement. The method's convenience couldn't compensate for its lethality, but desperate people accepted risks that rational analysis would have rejected. Children became collateral damage in the rural meth epidemic. Parents cooking in their homes exposed kids to toxic fumes and explosive hazards. Law enforcement agencies responding to meth labs found children living in houses contaminated with chemical residue, suffering respiratory problems and developmental delays from chronic exposure. Some children were burned or poisoned when labs exploded or chemicals were handled improperly. The scale of child endangerment was unprecedented. Methamphetamine wasn't just destroying users, it was harming entire families, including people who never chose to use the drug. Hospital emergency rooms in rural areas saw dramatic increases in meth-related admissions throughout the 2000s. Patients arrived experiencing psychosis, convinced that insects were crawling under their skin, a hallucination so common among meth users that medical professionals called it meth bugs. Others came in with cardiovascular emergencies, heart attacks and strokes in people far too young for those conditions. Dental patients presented with meth mouth, severe tooth decay and gum disease caused by the drug's effects on saliva production, combined with users' neglect of oral hygiene during multi-day binges. The physiological destruction that methamphetamine caused became impossible to ignore as the epidemic progressed. Long-term users showed dramatic physical deterioration that shocked communities watching their neighbours transform. Faces became gaunt and covered with sores from compulsive picking at skin while high. Teeth rotted and fell out. Weight dropped to skeletal levels as the drug suppressed appetite and users forgot to eat for days. People in their 30s looked 60. The visible destruction served as warning to potential users, but addiction's grip proved stronger than fear of physical consequences. Law enforcement in rural counties was completely overwhelmed by the scale of methamphetamine production. Sheriff's departments designed for occasional drunk driving arrests and property crimes suddenly faced hundreds of meth labs operating in their jurisdictions. Each lab required specialized hazmat response teams to safely dismantle and decontaminate, equipment and expertise that small-town departments didn't possess. State and federal task forces tried helping, but they were spread impossibly thin across thousands of miles of rural territory. The police were losing badly. Meth lab busts became routine features of local news across the Midwest. Police raided houses, trailers, motel rooms, and vehicles, arresting cooks and dismantling laboratories. Each bust generated celebratory press releases and community praise for law enforcement. But the arrests had zero impact on methamphetamine availability. For every lab dismantled, 2 more started operating. The drug's profitability meant that imprisoning one cook simply created a business opportunity for someone else. Enforcement was attacking symptoms without addressing underlying causes, economic desperation and unlimited demand. Property values collapsed in neighborhoods where meth labs operated or users congregated. Houses contaminated by chemical residue from meth production became essentially worthless. Cleanup costs often exceeded the property's market value. Landlords discovered tenants had cooked meth in rental properties, leaving behind toxic contamination that made the buildings uninhabitable. Some property owners simply abandoned contaminated houses rather than paying for remediation. Rural communities accumulated growing numbers of derelict, chemically contaminated properties that blighted neighborhoods and created public health hazards. The environmental damage from thousands of small meth labs exceeded the pollution from industrial facilities. Cooks dumped toxic waste in fields, forests, rivers, and municipal sewers without concern for environmental consequences. A single shake-and-bake cook might dump a gallon of toxic chemical waste multiple times weekly. Multiply this by thousands of cooks across dozens of states, and the cumulative environmental impact was catastrophic. Groundwater in some rural areas became contaminated with meth production byproducts. Soil absorbed heavy metals and solvents that would persist for decades. Foster care systems in rural states collapsed under the weight of children removed from homes where parents cooked or used methamphetamine. Iowa, Missouri, and Oklahoma saw foster care populations double or triple within a few years, as courts removed kids from dangerous environments. The states couldn't recruit foster families fast enough to house all the displaced children. Some kids lived in office buildings converted to emergency shelters because no other placements existed. The methamphetamine epidemic had created an orphan crisis in the American heartland. Rural hospitals faced financial crisis treating uninsured meth users who required expensive emergency care but couldn't pay. A meth-induced psychosis case requiring days of hospitalization might generate $50,000 in costs that the hospital would never collect. Burn victims from lab explosions needed specialized treatment at facilities hours away. Cardiac emergencies in young meth users required interventions that small rural hospitals weren't equipped to provide. The medical costs of the meth epidemic far exceeded available resources, forcing some rural hospitals to close entirely. The criminal justice system buckled under unprecedented caseloads as courts processed thousands of meth-related arrests. Rural counties lacked the jail space to hold everyone arrested on drug charges, forcing early releases or accepting plea bargains that would have been unthinkable in other circumstances. Public defenders handled impossible caseloads, unable to provide adequate representation to indigent defendants. Prosecutors prioritized cases based on severity, letting minor possession charges go unprosecuted because resources didn't exist to try every case. The system was triaging, deciding which cases deserved limited attention while the rest received cursory processing. Mandatory minimum sentencing laws for methamphetamine offences created absurd situations where small-time users received longer prison terms than violent criminals. A person caught with 5 grams of meth faced a 5-year mandatory minimum federal sentence, the same penalty as possessing 500 grams of cocaine. These disparities reflected political panic about meth rather than rational drug policy. prisons filled with low-level offenders serving harsh sentences, while major traffickers sometimes received lighter punishments through plea bargains. The sentencing structure was backwards, punishing addiction more severely than organized trafficking. Some rural communities developed creative responses to the methamphetamine crisis when traditional enforcement proved inadequate. Drug courts offered treatment alternatives to incarceration for non-violent offenders willing to complete rehabilitation programs. Community organizations established support groups for families affected by addiction. A few towns implemented pseudoephedrine prescription requirements that made shake-and-bake production more difficult. These local initiatives showed some success, but they were drops in an ocean. The problem's scale overwhelmed any community-level intervention. Pharmaceutical companies fought aggressively against restrictions on pseudoephedrine sales, claiming that limiting access would harm legitimate cold medication users. The industry spent millions lobbying against state laws requiring prescriptions for pseudoephedrine products. Their argument was technically correct. Prescription requirements would inconvenience people with actual colds. But the position prioritized pharmaceutical profits over addressing a drug crisis killing thousands. The companies eventually lost this battle as evidence of pseudoephedrine's role in meth production became overwhelming. The Combat Methamphetamine Epidemic Act of 2005 implemented federal restrictions on pseudoephedrine sales, requiring customer identification and limiting purchase quantities. Retailers moved cold medications behind pharmacy counters and tracked purchases through electronic databases. The law represented the most significant federal intervention in the meth crisis to that point. Initial results were promising. Domestic meth lab incidents declined by roughly 60% within 2 years as shake-and-bake production became more difficult. The celebration was premature. Domestic lab reductions had zero impact on methamphetamine availability because Mexican cartel production increased to fill any supply gap. The pseudoephedrine restrictions only affected small-time American cooks, while cartels purchased precursors by the ton from international suppliers unconcerned with U.S. laws. Street-level meth prices remained stable or decreased despite fewer domestic labs operating. The legislation had solved a visible problem, exploding meth houses, while completely failing to address actual drug availability. Cartel methamphetamine purity increased as domestic competition declined. Without biker labs or shake-and-bake cooks producing lower-quality product, cartels dominated the market with crystal meth approaching 95% purity. Users got stronger drugs than they had during the biker era, accelerating addiction development and increasing overdose risks. The unintended consequence of eliminating domestic production was handing market monopoly to organizations that produced the most addictive version of the drug possible. Rural communities watched their methamphetamine problems worsen, even after domestic labs declined. Users who previously bought locally produced crank now purchased cartel crystal meth that was cheaper and more addictive. The source had shifted from local producers to international trafficking organizations, but the addiction rates continued climbing. Small towns in Iowa and Missouri saw more residents using methamphetamine in 2010 than in 2000, despite massive law enforcement efforts and federal legislation. The drug had become endemic to rural American life. The stigma surrounding methamphetamine addiction prevented many users from seeking treatment. Meth was portrayed as a white trash drug in media coverage, associated with poverty and rural life, rather than treated as a medical crisis affecting people across demographic categories. This stigma meant that middle-class users hid their addiction to avoid social consequences, preventing early intervention. Politicians showed less interest in addressing meth compared to the opioid crisis that affected more politically influential constituencies. Rural drug users were essentially abandoned to deal with addiction in communities that lacked treatment infrastructure. Treatment options for methamphetamine addiction remained limited compared to opioid or alcohol addiction. No FDA-approved medications existed that reduced meth cravings or eased withdrawal the way methadone and buprenorphine helped heroin addicts. Behavioral therapies worked for some people, but required consistent participation and support structures that rural areas often couldn't provide. The most effective treatment, long-term residential rehabilitation, cost tens of thousands of dollars that uninsured rural residents couldn't afford. The treatment gap meant that most people struggling with meth addiction had no realistic path to recovery. The methamphetamine epidemic had hollowed out rural communities in ways that would take generations to repair. Lost productivity from addicted workers, children traumatized by exposure to drug use and manufacturing, families destroyed by addiction and incarceration, environmental contamination requiring expensive cleanup. These costs measured in billions of dollars and countless ruined lives. The drug that Nazi Germany had used to fuel conquest had conquered the American heartland through a different kind of warfare, one that targeted economic vulnerability rather than military weakness. Rural America was losing, and no end was visible. Methamphetamine cooks responded to the Combat Methamphetamine Act with criminal innovation that law enforcement hadn't anticipated. Smurfing emerged as the primary workaround, organised teams of people visiting multiple pharmacies to purchase legal quantities of pseudoephedrine from each location. A single Smurf might hit 20 pharmacies in one day, staying below purchase limits at each store while accumulating enough cold medication to supply large-scale meth production. Cooks recruited Smurfs by offering cash payments, drugs, or threatening people who owed them money or favours. The smurfing operations became sophisticated criminal enterprises. Organisers created routes optimizing the number of pharmacies that could be visited in a single day. They provided Smurfs with multiple forms of identification to avoid triggering purchase tracking systems. Some operations used stolen identities, making purchases under names that wouldn't be connected to the actual buyers. The systems rivaled legitimate business logistics in their efficiency and planning. Law enforcement had restricted legal access to pseudoephedrine, but criminals simply optimized their acquisition processes. Retail theft of cold medications skyrocketed as smurfing faced increasing restrictions. Organized retail crime rings stole pseudoephedrine products by the case from stores, then sold them to meth cooks at premium prices. Thieves developed techniques for defeating security systems and overwhelming store staff through coordinated group thefts. Some retailers lost tens of thousands of dollars in cold medication annually. The thefts forced stores to lock medications in security cases, inconveniencing legitimate customers while only marginally impeding determined criminals. State governments implemented varying restrictions, creating a patchwork of pseudoephedrine laws across America. Oregon and Mississippi required prescriptions for any pseudoephedrine purchase, essentially eliminating over-the-counter availability. Other states set lower purchase limits than federal law required. Some implemented real-time electronic tracking systems that prevented Smurfs from making multiple purchases at different stores within short periods. The inconsistent state regulations created confusion among retailers and opportunities for criminals who exploited jurisdictional differences. Pharmaceutical companies introduced pseudoephedrine-free cold medications as alternatives, but they were less effective than formulations containing the restricted ingredient. Phenylephrine replaced pseudoephedrine in many products, though studies eventually showed it was essentially worthless as a decongestant. Consumers frustrated with ineffective alternatives sometimes sought illegal sources for pseudoephedrine-containing products, creating a black market for cold medicine that served both legitimate users and meth cooks. The restrictions had turned ordinary cold medication into contraband. Mexico maintained minimal restrictions on pseudoephedrine sales throughout the 2000s, creating a cross-border acquisition channel that American enforcement couldn't shut down. People living near the border traveled to Mexican pharmacies to purchase cold medications without the identification requirements and quantity limits imposed in the United States. Some were legitimate customers avoiding inconvenient American restrictions. Others were purchasing for meth production or resale to cooks. Mexican cartels had unlimited access to precursors domestically, while Americans faced increasing obstacles obtaining the same chemicals. The pseudoephedrine restrictions successfully reduced domestic meth lab incidents from approximately 17,000 in 2005 to fewer than 4,000 by 2012. This decline represented a genuine law enforcement victory in reducing small-scale production's hazards. Fewer houses exploding, less environmental contamination, fewer children exposed to toxic chemicals. Police and politicians celebrated these statistics as evidence that the regulations were working. They ignored the more important metric: methamphetamine use rates weren't declining at all. Methamphetamine availability increased during the same period that domestic labs decreased. Mexican cartel production more than compensated for reduced American manufacturing. Street prices for meth dropped to historic lows. In some markets, a dose cost less than a beer. Purity remained at near pharmaceutical levels. Users noticed no disruption in supply despite massive law enforcement efforts and legislative restrictions. The pseudoephedrine wars had been won tactically while losing strategically. The market dynamics revealed a fundamental truth about drug prohibition that policymakers refused to acknowledge. Eliminating small suppliers only strengthens large organizations. Shutting down backyard meth cooks didn't reduce demand. It simply ensured that Mexican cartels captured 100% of market share rather than 90%. The cartels were more violent, more sophisticated, and produced more addictive products than domestic manufacturers. The regulations had inadvertently made the methamphetamine problem worse by consolidating production among the most dangerous organizations. The Sinaloa cartel's methamphetamine infrastructure expanded massively between 2005 and 2015. The organization operated an estimated 50 to 75 superlabs across Mexico at any given time, though exact numbers were impossible to verify because the cartels continuously opened new facilities as authorities shut down old ones. Each superlab could produce hundreds of kilograms weekly. The scale was industrial. Cartel meth production rivaled legitimate pharmaceutical manufacturing for common medications like antibiotics or antihistamines. Precursor chemical trafficking became as important to cartels as finished drug smuggling. Organizations established front companies throughout Asia, particularly in China, to purchase ephedrine and pseudoephedrine by the metric ton. These chemicals were shipped to Mexico through circuitous routes designed to obscure their final destination. Some shipments moved through multiple countries and changed ownership several times before reaching cartel-controlled facilities. The supply chains demonstrated sophistication that matched multinational corporations. China's role as primary supplier of methamphetamine precursors created international tensions that governments were reluctant to address directly. Chinese chemical companies generated enormous revenues selling to purchasers they knew or suspected were connected to drug trafficking. The Chinese government showed minimal interest in enforcing international agreements restricting precursor chemical sales. Some evidence suggested that Chinese authorities viewed precursor exports as economically beneficial, regardless of whether the chemicals ended up in illegal drug production. The situation created a de facto alliance between Chinese industry and Mexican cartels that American law enforcement was powerless to disrupt. The DEA attempted to pressure Chinese precursor suppliers through diplomatic channels and criminal investigations. American authorities identified specific companies shipping chemicals to known cartel front businesses. They provided evidence to Chinese law enforcement requesting action against these suppliers. The Chinese government rarely prosecuted cases that American authorities referred, citing insufficient evidence or jurisdictional issues. The diplomatic failure meant that precursor chemicals continued flowing from China to Mexico in unlimited quantities. Cartel chemists developed alternative synthesis routes using different precursors when pseudoephedrine became harder to obtain. The phenyl-2-propanone P2P method of methamphetamine synthesis had been known since the 1960s, but was rarely used because it was more complex than pseudoephedrine reduction. As restrictions tightened on traditional precursors, P2P synthesis became more attractive. This method used precursors that weren't regulated as strictly as pseudoephedrine, creating new supply chains that enforcement agencies needed years to identify and target. The P2P method produced methamphetamine with a different stereochemistry than pseudoephedrine reduction. It created a racemic mixture of both D-methamphetamine and L-methamphetamine rather than pure D-methamphetamine. The D-isomer was responsible for the drug's central nervous system effects, while the L-isomer had primarily peripheral effects. P2P meth was technically less potent than pseudoephedrine-derived product, but cartel chemists developed separation techniques to isolate the more active D-isomer. The cartels were conducting cutting-edge synthetic chemistry research to maintain product quality. Cartel innovation in methamphetamine production demonstrated the futility of precursor controls as a drug policy strategy. Whenever enforcement targeted one chemical pathway, chemists simply developed alternatives using different starting materials. The chemistry knowledge was publicly available in academic literature and textbooks. Trained chemists could design synthesis routes using whatever precursors were most easily obtained. Playing whack-a-mole with precursor chemicals was unwinnable. There were always alternative pathways that enforcement hadn't yet targeted. Methamphetamine purity reached unprecedented levels by 2010 as cartel production refined its processes. Laboratory analysis of seize samples showed average purity exceeding 90%, with some samples testing above 98%. This exceeded the purity of pharmaceutical methamphetamine that had been manufactured under FDA oversight during the 1950s and 1960s. The cartels had achieved pharmaceutical-grade production quality in industrial quantities, creating a product that was medically pure but being sold for recreational use to people with no understanding of proper dosing or risks. The high purity created severe overdose risks that users didn't recognize. Someone accustomed to 60% pure biker crank who switched to 95% pure cartel crystal might take the same physical quantity and receive nearly double the actual drug dose. This dosing confusion contributed to increasing emergency room visits and deaths from methamphetamine overdose. The drug hadn't become more dangerous, it had become more pure, which paradoxically made it more lethal because users couldn't accurately judge dosing. Treatment admissions for methamphetamine addiction increased throughout the period when domestic production was declining, proving that lab reduction hadn't addressed actual drug use. People seeking help for meth addiction rose from approximately 136,000 treatment admissions in 2008 to over 190,000 by 2015. The numbers demonstrated that despite all the law enforcement success against domestic labs and precursor restrictions, more Americans were using methamphetamine than before the regulations were implemented. The policy had failed by the only metric that actually mattered: user health and addiction rates. Rural communities that had celebrated declining meth lab explosions discovered they now faced different problems. Users were buying cartel-supplied crystal meth that was more addictive than locally produced crank had been. The social destruction continued while the visible signs, exploding houses and toxic waste dumps, decreased. Communities had traded obvious problems for hidden ones. The meth epidemic had become less visible, but no less devastating. Law enforcement agencies shifted resources toward interdiction and distribution network disruption since they could no longer target domestic production effectively. Task forces focused on identifying cartel distribution cells and seizing shipments crossing the border. This strategy showed some tactical successes, major busts that captured hundreds of kilograms of methamphetamine and arrested significant traffickers. But the strategic impact was negligible. Cartel production capacity exceeded demand by substantial margins, meaning seized shipments were irrelevant to street-level availability. The economics made traditional enforcement approaches futile. A cartel superlab producing 500 kilograms of methamphetamine weekly generated approximately $20 million in revenue at wholesale prices. Even if authorities shut down such a lab, the organization could build a replacement facility for under $1 million and be operational within weeks. The profit margins were so extreme that enforcement actions became mere business costs that cartels easily absorbed. Destroying 10 superlabs might seem like major success, but cartels could afford to build 20 replacements if the market justified it. Politicians and law enforcement agencies claimed victory in the war on methamphetamine based on declining domestic lab numbers, while ignoring the reality that addiction and availability had both increased. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. Officials celebrated statistics showing they were winning while the actual drug problem worsened. The pseudoephedrine wars had succeeded in eliminating one method of production while strengthening the more dangerous alternative. The war had been won and lost simultaneously. Mexican cartels began adulterating methamphetamine with fentanyl around 2016, creating a hybrid threat that combined stimulant addiction with opioid overdose risk. The mixing wasn't accidental contamination from shared production facilities, it was deliberate strategy. Cartels discovered that adding small amounts of fentanyl to methamphetamine created a unique high that kept users coming back more reliably than pure meth alone. The combination was pharmacologically insane, a powerful stimulant mixed with a powerful depressant, but it worked exactly as traffickers intended. Users seeking methamphetamine stimulant effects suddenly died from opioid overdoses without understanding what killed them. Someone expecting to get high and stay awake for days instead stopped breathing within minutes of use. Naloxone, the overdose reversal drug that saves heroin users, worked on the fentanyl component but left people still intoxicated from methamphetamine, creating chaotic medical situations where patients oscillated between opioid overdose and stimulant psychosis. Emergency responders were trained to handle either opioids or stimulants, not both simultaneously in the same patient. The death toll from fentanyl-laced methamphetamine accelerated dramatically between 2016 and 2021. Overdose deaths involving both methamphetamine and synthetic opioids increased by over 50-fold during this period. People who thought they were experienced meth users with high tolerance died because they had no tolerance to fentanyl. The drug market had become a pharmacological minefield, where users couldn't know whether their purchase contained only the drug they wanted or a potentially lethal adulterant. Cartels had multiple motivations for adding fentanyl to methamphetamine beyond simply creating more addictive products. Fentanyl was extraordinarily cheap to produce or purchase from Chinese suppliers. A kilogram cost a few $1,000s and could adulterate thousands of doses. Adding fentanyl increased profit margins while requiring minimal additional production infrastructure. Some cartel chemists believe the combination created smoother come-downs from meth stimulant effects, reducing the crash that made users reluctant to continue use. The calculation was entirely economic. Dead customers were acceptable losses if overall market demand increased. Methamphetamine purity paradoxically reached its highest levels during the same period that fentanyl contamination was killing users. Cartel-produced crystal meth tested at 97 or so 99% purity in laboratory analysis, virtually pharmaceutical grade. This meant the methamphetamine itself was as pure as chemically possible, but some batches contained fentanyl intentionally added to the pure product. Users faced a bizarre situation where the meth was exceptionally high quality, but potentially mixed with a substance that would kill them. Quality control had become meaningless when the product itself was deadly. The pharmaceutical industry's role in the methamphetamine story took a twisted turn when companies reintroduced prescription methamphetamine for ADHD treatment. Desoxin, pharmaceutical-grade methamphetamine, remained FDA approved and was prescribed to children and adults for attention deficit disorders. The same chemical destroying lives on streets was being legally prescribed to treat medical conditions. This created absurd situations where parents warned children about the dangers of meth, while those children took pharmaceutical methamphetamine daily under doctor supervision. The medical establishment maintained that prescription methamphetamine was fundamentally different from street meth, despite identical chemistry. Doctors argued that proper dosing, medical supervision, and pharmaceutical purity made prescription use safe. This argument ignored history. The pharmaceutical meth epidemic of the 1950s had involved proper dosing and medical supervision, yet it still created widespread addiction. The chemistry hadn't changed. The drug's effects on the brain hadn't changed. Only the marketing and medical rationalization had evolved. COVID-19 pandemic lockdowns disrupted drug trafficking temporarily in early 2020, but cartels adapted within weeks. Methamphetamine shipments continued crossing the border, using essential worker exemptions and cargo transport that remained operational. Street-level distribution shifted to delivery models rather than face-to-face transactions in public spaces. Some dealers used food delivery apps to coordinate methamphetamine sales, disguising drug transactions as legitimate food orders. The pandemic barely slowed the drug trade. It simply forced minor operational modifications. Economic devastation from pandemic lockdowns created conditions that increased methamphetamine demand. Unemployment surged, small businesses collapsed, social isolation intensified. People trapped at home with financial stress and limited social support turned to drugs for escape or relief. Methamphetamine use increased across demographic categories that hadn't traditionally shown high rates. White-collar professionals working from home, suburban residents, middle-aged people facing unexpected job loss. The pandemic had democratized meth use beyond its traditional rural and working-class user base. Cartel methamphetamine production reached industrial scales that exceeded anything seen previously. Some Mexican superlabs could produce over 1 metric ton of crystal meth weekly, enough to supply over 300,000 individual doses. The cartels were operating chemical facilities comparable to mid-sized pharmaceutical manufacturers, except without any regulatory oversight or safety protocols. Production capacity far exceeded American demand, creating surplus that cartels exported to other countries including Australia, Japan, and European nations where meth markets were expanding. Asian organized crime syndicates entered the global methamphetamine market aggressively during the 2010s, competing with Mexican cartels in some regions while collaborating in others. Chinese triads, Japanese yakuza, and Southeast Asian trafficking organizations produced meth for their domestic markets and export. These groups had access to precursor chemicals without needing to import them, giving them cost advantages over Mexican producers in Asian markets. The methamphetamine trade had become truly globalized, with multiple criminal organizations operating sophisticated production and distribution networks across continents. The dark web facilitated international methamphetamine trafficking by connecting buyers and sellers who would never have found each other through traditional channels. Vendors shipped crystal meth internationally through mail services, concealing drugs in packages disguised as legitimate products. Cryptocurrency payments made transactions difficult to trace. Law enforcement agencies struggled to investigate crimes that occurred entirely online, using encryption and anonymization technologies. The internet had given drug trafficking a new dimension that rendered traditional geographic enforcement boundaries obsolete. Methamphetamine prices in the United States dropped to unprecedented lows by 2020. A gram of high-purity crystal meth cost $20–40 in many markets, comparable to a pizza delivery. Adjusted for inflation, methamphetamine was cheaper than it had been at any point in the past 50 years, despite being higher quality. This price collapse reflected cartel overproduction and fierce competition among distributors. Cheap, pure meth flooded the market in quantities that made the 1990s supply look limited by comparison. Treatment infrastructure for methamphetamine addiction remained grossly inadequate despite escalating use rates. Unlike opioid addiction, which could be treated with medications like methadone and buprenorphine, no FDA-approved pharmaceutical treatments existed specifically for meth addiction. Behavioral therapies worked for some people, but success rates were lower than for other substance use disorders. Residential treatment programs were expensive and had months-long waiting lists. Most people struggling with meth addiction had no realistic access to effective treatment, particularly in rural areas where the problem was most severe. The neuroscience of methamphetamine addiction explained why treatment was so difficult. The drug caused potentially permanent changes to brain dopamine systems that persisted long after use stopped. Recovering meth addicts experienced anhedonia, inability to feel pleasure from normal activities that could last months or years. Food, sex, social interaction, and other normally rewarding experiences felt flat and uninteresting compared to memories of meth's intense high. This created powerful incentives for relapse because sobriety felt psychologically unbearable. The brain damage wasn't always permanent, but recovery was measured in years, not weeks or months. Methamphetamine-related deaths increased by over 300% between 2015 and 2021, driven largely by fentanyl contamination, but also by the cumulative cardiovascular damage from long-term use. People in their 30s and 40s died from heart attacks and strokes, conditions that would normally affect much older populations. The drug stimulant effects stressed cardiovascular systems beyond their limits, causing failures that killed users who might have survived for years, if not for meth's effects on their hearts and blood vessels. The stigma surrounding methamphetamine addiction prevented public health responses that might have saved lives. Politicians showed far more interest in addressing the opioid epidemic, which affected predominantly white middle-class populations, than the meth crisis, which was associated with poor, rural and marginalized communities. Funding for meth addiction treatment and research remained a fraction of what was directed toward opioid problems. The message was clear. Some addicts deserved help and sympathy, while others deserved criminalization and neglect. Harm reduction strategies that worked for other drugs proved difficult to implement for methamphetamine. Needle exchange programs could reduce HIV and hepatitis transmission among people who injected meth, but no equivalent to methadone maintenance existed for stimulant addiction. Drug checking services could identify fentanyl in meth supplies, but users often had no alternative sources if their supply tested positive for adulterants. The harm reduction toolkit developed for opioids didn't translate effectively to stimulant drugs, leaving public health workers with limited options for reducing meth-related harms. The criminal justice system continued incarcerating methamphetamine users and low-level dealers at high rates, despite overwhelming evidence that imprisonment didn't reduce drug use. Prisons were full of people serving long sentences for meth offences, particularly in rural states where meth was the dominant drug problem. Incarceration disrupted lives, separated families, and imposed enormous costs on taxpayers without producing measurable reductions in drug availability or use. The policy was expensive failure, but it persisted because politicians feared appearing soft on drugs. Cartel violence in Mexico reached catastrophic levels as organizations fought for control of methamphetamine production territories. The Jalisco New Generation cartel challenged the Sinaloa cartel's dominance, triggering conflicts that killed tens of thousands. Entire regions of Mexico became war zones where cartels operated openly and government authority existed only nominally. The violence was directly funded by American methamphetamine consumption. Every dollar spent on meth in the United States flowed to organizations that used those profits to purchase weapons and wage wars. The methamphetamine crisis in 2025 was worse by every objective measure than it had been in 2000. Despite billions spent on enforcement and 2 decades of drug war policies, more people used meth. The drug was purer and cheaper. Treatment remained largely unavailable. Deaths were increasing rather than declining. The cartels were stronger and more sophisticated than ever. The only thing that had changed was the narrative. Politicians now acknowledged the crisis existed, though they showed no willingness to try dramatically different approaches that might actually work. The war on methamphetamine had been comprehensively lost, but no one was ready to admit defeat. The fundamental economics of methamphetamine ensured that no enforcement strategy could eliminate the drug, regardless of resources devoted to the effort. Production costs remained negligible. A few $100s in precursor chemicals yielded products worth thousands at wholesale and tens of thousands at retail. This profit margin exceeded nearly every other criminal enterprise, including cocaine, heroin, and human trafficking. As long as demand existed, someone would supply methamphetamine because the financial incentives were overwhelming and the barriers to entry were minimal. Chemical synthesis knowledge had become impossible to suppress in the Internet age. Detailed methamphetamine production methods existed on countless websites, in chemistry textbooks available through libraries, and in academic journals accessible to anyone with university access. Underground chemist communities shared refinements and innovations through encrypted forums. The information couldn't be destroyed or controlled. It was permanently embedded in human knowledge. Anyone with chemistry training and determination could learn to produce methamphetamine regardless of law enforcement efforts. The drug's pharmacology created addiction with efficiency that few substances could match. Methamphetamine flooded the brain with dopamine at levels that natural rewards could never approach, establishing a neurological preference for the drug over everything else. Food, relationships, career, safety, all became secondary to obtaining and using meth once addiction developed. This wasn't moral failure or weak character, it was predictable neurobiology. The brain had been hijacked by a chemical that exploited evolutionary reward systems, never designed to handle synthetic stimulants. Recovery from methamphetamine addiction faced obstacles that made sustained sobriety extraordinarily difficult. The brain's dopamine systems required months or years to recover from meth-induced damage. During this recovery period, users experienced severe depression, inability to feel pleasure, profound fatigue, and cognitive impairment. Life felt unbearable without the drug. Relapse rates exceeded 90% within the first year of attempted sobriety. The few people who achieved long-term recovery typically required multiple treatment attempts, strong social support, and circumstances that allowed them to avoid triggers and drug-using associates. No pharmaceutical treatment existed that could reverse methamphetamine's effects on the brain or reduce cravings with the effectiveness that methadone or buprenorphine showed for opioid addiction. Researchers had tested various medications, including antidepressants, antipsychotics, and other stimulants, but none demonstrated consistent efficacy in clinical trials. The FDA had approved no medications specifically for methamphetamine addiction treatment. This left behavioral therapy as the primary intervention, an approach that worked for some people, but had lower success rates than medication-assisted treatment for opioids. Brain imaging studies revealed the extent of damage that chronic methamphetamine use inflicted on neural structures. PET scans showed reduced dopamine transporter density in the striatum, a brain region critical for reward processing and motivation. These changes persisted for months or years after drug use stopped, potentially never fully recovering in some long-term users. The structural brain alterations explained why recovering meth addicts struggled with depression, anhedonia, and intense cravings long after detoxification. The drug had caused physical brain damage that time alone couldn't necessarily heal. The geographic distribution of methamphetamine use had expanded beyond its rural and working-class origins to affect virtually every demographic and region. Urban professionals used meth to work longer hours. College students took it to enhance academic performance. LGBTQ communities in major cities experienced severe meth problems linked to party and sex cultures. The drug had achieved something approaching universal appeal. Different populations used it for different reasons, but the result was the same neurological destruction regardless of user motivation or social context. Mexican cartels had diversified beyond methamphetamine into producing synthetic opioids, synthetic cannabinoids, and designer stimulants, but meth remained their most profitable product by volume. The organizations had invested heavily in production infrastructure that could synthesize various drugs depending on market demand. This flexibility meant that even if methamphetamine demand somehow declined, the cartels could pivot to producing whatever substances consumers wanted. The criminal organizations weren't going away regardless of which specific drugs they trafficked. Chinese chemical companies continued supplying precursors to Mexican cartels, despite international pressure and nominal regulatory controls. The companies used shell corporations, falsified shipping documents, and routed chemicals through third countries to obscure transactions. Some Chinese manufacturers produced designer precursors, chemicals that were one synthesis step away from regulated substances, allowing them to claim they weren't selling controlled materials. The cat-and-mouse game between regulators and precursor suppliers had no foreseeable end because economic incentives favoured the suppliers and enforcement was geographically limited. Alternative synthesis routes using non-traditional precursors continued emerging as chemists adapted to enforcement targeting specific chemicals. Academic researchers published new synthetic methods in chemistry journals without considering that their work would be used for illegal drug production. Each new publication potentially provided traffickers with blueprints for avoiding current regulations. The scientific literature was essentially an open-source database of synthesis methods that criminals could exploit faster than regulators could respond. Underground chemists had begun producing novel synthetic stimulants that mimicked methamphetamine's effects while using different molecular structures to avoid existing drug laws. These research chemicals, or designer drugs, were often more dangerous than methamphetamine because they were completely untested in humans. Users became unwitting guinea pigs for substances that might cause catastrophic health effects not seen with traditional meth. The innovation cycle ensured that even if methamphetamine somehow disappeared, functionally equivalent drugs would replace it within months. The COVID-19 pandemic had demonstrated that disrupting normal social and economic life increased rather than decreased drug use. Isolation, unemployment, and stress drove people towards substances that provided escape or relief. Future crises, economic recessions, natural disasters, pandemics, would likely generate similar patterns. Methamphetamine use served as a barometer for social dysfunction. When communities struggled, meth use increased. This meant that reducing methamphetamine addiction required addressing underlying social problems like unemployment, lack of healthcare access, and social isolation. Challenges far more complex than drug enforcement. Treatment capacity remained grossly inadequate even in regions that acknowledged the methamphetamine crisis. Residential treatment programs had months-long waiting lists. Outpatient programs were overwhelmed with clients and understaffed. Many insurance plans provided minimal coverage for substance abuse treatment, forcing people to pay out-of-pocket costs that were prohibitive for unemployed or underemployed meth users. The treatment gap meant that most people who wanted help couldn't access it, even if they were motivated to quit. The political economy of drug policy prevented dramatic reforms that might improve outcomes. Private prison corporations profited from incarcerating drug offenders. Law enforcement agencies received federal funding based partly on drug arrest statistics. Politicians feared being portrayed as soft on crime if they advocated for treatment over punishment. These institutional incentives maintained failed policies long after evidence showed they didn't work. The system was optimized for perpetuating itself rather than solving the problems it supposedly addressed. Harm reduction approaches that reduced deaths in other countries faced political opposition in the United States based on moral objections to acknowledging drug use rather than demanding abstinence. Safe injection sites, drug checking services, and distribution of clean supplies were labelled as enabling addiction by critics who preferred that addicts die rather than be given resources to use drugs more safely. The moral framework prevented pragmatic public health interventions that would have saved lives without necessarily reducing drug use. The methamphetamine crisis reflected deeper failures in American social and economic policy. Communities devastated by deindustrialization and agricultural collapse had no economic opportunities to replace lost jobs. Healthcare systems didn't provide adequate mental health and addiction services. Social safety nets were too weak to protect vulnerable populations from falling into addiction. Drug use was a symptom of these structural problems, not the underlying cause. Addressing methamphetamine addiction required rebuilding communities and providing hope for better lives, interventions far more expensive and politically difficult than law enforcement. The international dimensions of methamphetamine trafficking made national enforcement strategies insufficient even if they were well designed and funded. Cartels operated across borders, sourced precursors from multiple countries, and distributed through international networks. Effective intervention required unprecedented cooperation between nations with competing interests and different legal frameworks. The coordination challenges were immense, and historical precedent suggested that achieving the necessary international collaboration was unlikely. Synthetic drug manufacturing represented a fundamentally different challenge than plant-based drug production. Cocaine and heroin required specific crops grown in limited geographic regions that could theoretically be targeted through crop eradication and alternative development programs. Methamphetamine could be produced anywhere with access to precursor chemicals and basic laboratory equipment. There was no crop to eradicate, no specific region to target. The flexibility of synthetic drug production made enforcement exponentially more difficult. The 130-year journey from Nagai Nagayoshi's laboratory to American streets revealed a pattern that repeated across multiple countries and contexts. A drug developed for legitimate medical purposes became a tool of military enhancement, then a pharmaceutical product marketed to millions, then a street drug controlled by criminal organizations. At each stage, Authorities claimed they could manage the risks through proper regulations and controls. At each stage, they were wrong. The cycle was predictable, yet governments continued making the same mistakes with new substances. Methamphetamine's story demonstrated that chemical knowledge, once released, could never be contained. The synthesis methods that allowed pharmaceutical companies to produce beneficial medications were identical to those that enabled criminal organizations to manufacture addictive drugs. This dual-use problem had no solution. The chemistry was neutral, and the knowledge couldn't be selectively erased. Society had to live with the consequences of chemical knowledge that could be used for good or evil depending on who controlled it. The drug war's failure wasn't due to insufficient resources or inadequate enforcement. It was structural and inevitable. Demand created supply. Enormous profits attracted sophisticated criminal organizations. Enforcement created market opportunities for whoever survived the crackdown. Treatment was underfunded and often ineffective. The cycle was self-perpetuating. Every intervention produced unintended consequences that often worsened the problems they were designed to solve. Methamphetamine would continue destroying lives and communities for the foreseeable future because none of the conditions that sustained the epidemic were changing meaningfully. Demand remained high. Cartels controlled production and distribution through sophisticated organizations that adapted to enforcement faster than authorities could respond. Treatment was largely unavailable. Underlying social conditions that made people vulnerable to addiction were deteriorating rather than improving. The trajectory pointed toward more devastation, not less. The only certainty was that the methamphetamine story would continue evolving in ways that nobody could fully predict. New synthesis methods would emerge, cartels would innovate, user demographics would shift, but the fundamental pattern would persist. A chemical that promised enhanced performance and euphoria would deliver temporary illusion followed by neurological devastation and often death. The drug that began as medicine intended to heal had become a weapon that destroyed with mathematical precision, and humanity still had no effective defense against it.